Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Capital Planning Commission, where we are going to have what I think is a historic day today, where we are focusing on the redesign of select White House grounds, particularly the President's Park South. It's not every day that we have an event like this where we are focusing on the redesign of sections of the historic White House grounds. So welcome to this good day. As many of you know, we are following somewhat similar the same process we did back in the early 2000s when NCPC, I think to great acclaim, led a process for the study and redesign and reopening of Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House, and now we are doing something very similar on the other side of the White House. Momentarily, I'll ask the panel members to introduce themselves for the benefit of the audience, and we'll also note we are streaming live on the web, so others are watching these proceedings. I'll also note that leading up to today, we have been soliciting public input, public comments on the 5 designs that we have happily before us. At the White House Visitor Center, there have been displays and opportunities for the public to participate online. We've also been monitoring blogs and other things just to stay abreast of what folks are, how folks are seeing these designs and what their thoughts are. So, and for the jury here, those comments are at your station. NCPC initiated this design competition to generate a lot of creative and thoughtful approaches to President's Park South. A couple of points to make. One is there's still a long way to go in this process. In doing this design competition, I will say that we have gone through a structured and legal procurement process so that once NCPC and the task force here, I should say, rallies around or generally comes to a consensus on a particular design, we will then pass off that design and recommendations to the National Park Service, who in collaboration with the Secret Service and many other stakeholders may wish to go forward with that design as is or in some amended form. We have paid, and as part of the criteria, we paid special attention to both the security concerns of the White House in those grounds, as well as paying special attention to the historic landscape and the historic preservation of the area. So the process has been important. Bill Dowd shortly will go through the criteria for the design process that our selected designers have been using. We're receiving all of the input and presentations today, and at the end of today's presentations, there also will be an opportunity for public participation so that we will hear public comments. What we will do in deliberations tomorrow is the task force here will hopefully come to consensus on a particular preliminary design or concept, and then go forward. So we will, for all practicable purposes, be picking a winner of the design competition. But let me stress, it's still a preliminary design that the National Park Service and other stakeholders will continue working with the selected designer. With that, let's start with Bill Dowd and just go around the table here for the benefit of others in the room and those watching who our task force members are.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Dowd, the Director of Physical Planning here at NCPC.
Alex Krieger, consultant to the NCPC for the competition.
I'm Marcel Acosta, the Executive Director at NCPC.
Harriet Tregoning, I'm the Director of Planning for the District of Columbia.
Tom Lubke, I'm the Secretary of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts.
Peter May, Associate Regional Director for Lands, Resources, and Planning for the National Park Service.
And I'm Preston Bryant, Chairman of the National Capital Planning Commission.
Tom Doherty, Deputy Assistant Director for United States Secret Service.
Tom DeSale, I'm Assistant Director of Security for the Department of Commerce.
Mina Wright, Director of Planning and Design Quality, NCR GSA.
Troy Brown. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning, the Architect of the Capitol.
Chief Architect, General Services Administration.
Dick Friedman, former Chairman of NCPC and a consultant to the group.
Terrific. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. At this point, let me turn it over to Bill Dowd, who will talk a little bit about process and the criteria under which we've all been operating. Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the couple of points that I would just sort of reiterate and summarize is where we fit in the larger process of developing a solution to President Park South and how to address the security and balance that with the important access to that public space. This design competition is part of a larger process that is being undertaken by the Secret Service and the Park Service, and that was initiated with an environmental assessment back in March, where there was a public scoping meeting that those agencies managed and are gathering ideas. The designs that come out of this competition will then be used within that environmental assessment process to be further considered and evaluated as they select a design concept to move forward through the review process. So we will see something again, hopefully soon, so that the Planning Commission can take an action on that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is what were the criteria that we gave the designers to come up with their design concepts in response to, and what are the criteria that you, the jury, will be considering as you evaluate the concepts. On May 9th, we had a briefing for the competitors and gave them a relatively lengthy document of design criteria that got into the specific issues, but the front page of that included 5 overarching objectives, and I think I'd like to share those here with the task force. And those are that 1, the design accomplish effective security for the White House and its grounds. 2, minimizes conflicts between official traffic entering and exiting the south side of the White House and visitors approaching and/or viewing the White House. 3, creates an attractive environment that is not dominated by security elements for daily passersby and visitors approaching the southern fence of the White House. 4, maintains and preserves the historic integrity of President's Park South. And 5, does not preclude the possibility of reintroducing traffic along the East Street corridor in the future should the threat environment change and the government elect to do so. So those were the criteria that we gave them. I guess I'll keep my opinions to myself. I thought the design concepts actually addressed those in a lot of interesting and creative ways, and really excited to hear the presentations by each of the design firms. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Bill. We've been very pleased to be working with Alex Krieger as our consultant to help run and manage the design competition. Alex is not a stranger to the National Capital Planning Commission. In the early 2000s, around 2002, he led, in conjunction with NCPC, the design competition to reopen or redesign and then reopen Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House. Alex is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's been there for 35 years, long time. And he served as chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Harvard Graduate School. And he also is a practitioner. His specialty obviously is in urban design. He has for many years headed a 35 or 40 member firm who just March a year ago merged with NBBJ, which is a truly global architecture and urban design firm. So we're very pleased to have Alex back working with NCPC on this very, very important project. So at this point, let me turn it over to Alex to say a few words about the design competition and the firms that have been involved to date. Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it is a pleasure being back before the task force. This is, as we all know, it's a challenging, it's an intriguing, it's a very important project, and therefore getting the most creative minds in the design fields to study the problem, to kind of ponder it, to offer ideas, seems a very wise thing to do. And that, in a sense, explains why a design competition is the best format to achieve, to invite the most talented individuals and firms, and to invite them to offer their ideas. And I believe, as you've examined the material, it's already been publicized that they've all risen to the occasion. And I as well look forward to seeing them present their ideas. The 5 finalist firms were selected from quite a large group of organizations that submitted their qualifications through an open process from around the country. And a pre-selection committee examined them and chose these 5 finalists, and that committee was made up of actually Richard Friedman, a former chairman of the NCPC Commission, also one of the founders of the task force, the Security Task Force, Tom Lupke, who also sits before you from the Fine Arts Commission, Bill Dowd, Michael Vergensen, a noted landscape architect from this region, and myself. And we had a hard time selecting these 5, but believe that, as you will see their presentations, that we made the right choice. And lastly, I will just say that, just to second what Bill said, it's important for all of you to kind of listen, to reflect, and to kind of focus on the 5 criteria which this competition addresses, and base your decisions on those criteria. And with that, I think we're ready to hear from the first of the finalists, Reed Hildebrand, a wonderful firm from Watertown, Massachusetts. And again, each of the presenters will have 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, led by the chairman. And we'll try to stick to this as much as possible, given that we have a long afternoon ahead of us. So with the representatives from Reed Hildebrand, please. Yes, the boards come up, yes. Would you
And I'll say, because this is being recorded and streamed, make sure everyone use a microphone here, and certainly stay close to the microphone there. And we also have roving microphones that we can distribute for during the question period if necessary.
Good afternoon. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Members of the task force, thank you for asking us to be here this afternoon. I want to say on behalf of our team, the Reed Hildebrand team, that it's an enormous honor and a real privilege to be speaking with you today about the proposal before us for the President's Park South. I'd like to
and for the record, your name.
Sorry, I'm Gary Hildebrand. I'm principal of Reed Hildebrand Landscape Architects in Watertown, Massachusetts. I would like several of my teammates to be recognized. My business partner, Douglas Reed, one of my colleagues and senior associate, Chris Moyles, Adam Urinsky, principal of Architecture Research Office, and Charles Birnbaum of the Cultural Landscape Foundation here in Washington. Thank you. You've asked us to address 5 criteria, and I want to hit those very directly. And I note that we have reordered them. And so I'd like to address the first 3 on my screen, which is a different order than you asked us to address. Achieve effective security for the White House, for the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, and the U.S. Department of Treasury and other sites. Minimize conflicts between official traffic and visiting traffic. And your last criterion, which we place here, provide a reversible solution for E Street. I'll address these 3 criteria first. I stood last night with one of my colleagues just a couple of hundred yards from the fence of the south lawn of the White House. And it's not a surprise to anyone here that one has a mixed reaction to standing there. We propose that an open and secure place be provided there for really anyone who has the desire to go and stand before one of the great symbols of American democracy and one of the symbols of freedom around the world. It's actually quite sad to see visitors from our nation and from elsewhere get to the barriers and not understand why they cannot get that view. And having worked over this for some 4 or 5 weeks, it's still very potent to stand in that space and realize that we have a defensive position today, not one of open and secure freedom and democracy. This is our plan as submitted in the competition drawings, and our proposal situates a very succinct and precise intervention primarily in the seam between the south lawn of the White House and the ellipse. We're sure that our project meets the protocols that have been set forth by the Secret Service and others. We need to protect these assets and the First Family, that's for sure. We rely effectively on protocols that have been in place for the past 10 years and are somewhat proven, though they are not particularly beautiful, and they do no justice to the park in which they sit. So we focus on current devices and approaches to security, and we reorganize them, and we overlap that set of protocols with the ellipse itself, thereby joining, we think, the park. There is one quite important step that needs to be taken on what we would consider to be the path that eventually frees the ellipse from private parking and returns it to the status that it deserves within reservation number 1. And so our proposal keeps the restricted parking in these locations, reorganizes parking and traffic into and out of the ellipse, and removes 260 pass holder parking spaces, or approximately 29% of the current supply. We also note that within the same 8-minute walking distance to the White House, there are reserves in private garages and on the street of at least 8,400 parking spaces. That provision, we suggest, could happen by removing parking in the northern portion of the ellipse, joining that with a promenade, and entering the ellipse and parking in a one-way fashion, entering from 17th Avenue and leaving on 15th. Now I'll recite some of the details of that security program. We organize traffic in on the west side, exactly where it comes in today, and on the east side, solely at the southern entrance of the current access today. Sally ports east and west, the one on the west accommodating a larger number of vehicles if needed. Guard booths and canine facilities that would support this organization. One-way traffic in each of these 2 routes and out, and passing through another set of gates, as you know there are today, when that kind of passage is required. This allows us a vehicle-free zone, which is secured by hardened bollards and fences, and passes right to the south lawn of the White House with the existing historic fence. That zone is also securable when there is the need for somewhat increased standoff distance from the south lawn of the White House. This proposal also allows emergency vehicles to pass unencumbered, with the exception of bollards that are controlled by guards in those locations. And if there is the eventuality that something called E Street would return, we believe this is a reversible proposition. And lastly, among this organization, that row of bollards which keeps the pedestrian zone clear of vehicles allows us a bicycle way that is dedicated through this zone as well, which is outside the K-12 secure zone. In this view, we can see all of those systems overlapping with a clarity that I've described. Vehicles entering from 15th here and proceeding through the Sallyport and in. Pedestrians coming from Pershing Park and Pennsylvania Avenue and other locations to the east, flowing freely through that bollarded condition. You can see that sometimes bollards have chains, and the bicycle way there furthest south. The other two criteria perhaps are harder. Job number one, it's very clear from your communications with us, is to make the White House and its other assets secure. There's no doubt. But we can't do that and do harm as those devices which are out there today do to some of our most valued resources in this country. We square very strongly with Andrew Jackson Downing here, who wanted this space to be one of civic gesture, one of decorum. And he invoked the term promenading because that was something that seemed to be able to meet the dignity of the presidency and the freedom of the people. We were also very taken in our briefing last month with a presenter who said that this is where the president meets the people. And a 20th century view of that means that the ellipse is a place where a lot of things can happen. It doesn't quite work that way today. And we don't have any ball fields officially, though I saw plenty of sports activity there yesterday afternoon. We also believe that when you return the ellipse to the people, you reconnect the president with the people's ellipse and with the Washington Monument, the grounds of the National Mall, what we like to think of as our nation's front yard. That view, which is envisioned by Washington and L'Enfant, is there. There are a few things in the way today, but it is there. And that president presides over the people in that view. We know, though, that this is a landscape that has changed really quite immensely over many, many years. As recently as the 1940s, there was a full canopy around the ellipse, a strong canopy connecting the ellipse to the south lawn of the White House and the White House grounds, Lafayette Park. 15 years ago, that canopy was depleted and replanted and still has to be connected back. So we imagine that part of this project is to reconnect and to be faithful, in a sense, to a strong continuum of history that this park has enjoyed, recognizing that change is required in order to make that happen. So we see that location, which is commonly called E Street, but has only been called E Street for a fairly short period in the history of this park, as a place where we can intervene quite strongly and very sensitively in order to organize and overlap these very related concerns. And that is our plan, to overlap and to join the South Lawn with the ellipse. To do so, we go back to Downing in a way, but we don't want a Downing-esque proposition here. We go to the great urban tradition, which is so evident here in Washington and has been borrowed in Washington from European continent and elsewhere. The tradition of promenading. This is an urbanistic proposal, and this is an urban place. We have a legacy of Andrew Jackson Downing and Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and many other significant figures in American landscape architecture situating urban conditions like these promenades, like the mall in Central Park, like Olmsted Jr.'s Lincoln Reflecting Pool, and like Pennsylvania Avenue recently reconstituted, situating these within a picturesque park. These are not in contrast. These are, in fact, enriching by adjacency. And that's a great tradition. So we see that promenade as the connective tissue that joins these parks together. And we see a shaded, diverse, strong, honorific, and really well-populated place that is built to last and built sustainably. We imagine that it's enormously important to privilege the American elm in this park. No one would argue with that. And we plan to supplement and amplify the presence of the elm here, as indicated in our drawing. We also think it's urgent that that canopy be diversified and that its performance be improved. And so we build soils in our proposal and an hydrology system that will allow us to describe a continuum, eventually returning to that full canopy that did join the president's house with the ellipse in this decade, in this past century. Part of that is a hydrological system which is essential, we think, is absolutely one of the commanding themes of our time. And this has to be a park of our time. To capture rainwater and to use it wisely, and to deliver it back, and to gain for this park the claim that we are no longer throwing potable water down the sink, and that we are reusing our resources wisely. Finally, I'd like to thank you for the bell. It's an understatement to say that this property, which President Washington designated as Reservation Number 1, has exceptional historical significance. If you look at the Secretary of Interior's criteria for significance, the period of significance for this site is almost 200 years. That is unlike almost any other landscape we have. Cynthia Zaitsevsky, in her 1996 cultural landscape study, identified the dilemma we face, which is we cannot privilege a single period of significance when we have so many. That's why we believe that it's important that we call upon our best instincts as preservationists and our capacities as designers to create an intervention which produces yet another level of continuum on this site, and by doing so, returns all of the significant parts which are already here to their intended glory. Thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hildebrand. Thank you, Mr. Hildebrand, very much. We'll now have 15 minutes of questions and answers from the task force. Please feel free, if a question is most appropriately answered by a member of your team, we have microphones here. And if you do answer, please identify yourself, your name, just for the record.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Task force members. Mr. Goning?
I do have a question about your prominent use of bollards. I realize that part of your presentation is about taking the existing elements that are in the security scheme and reordering them, but in some ways, in the evolution of our ideas about security, obvious bollards are becoming less frequently used, and instead security features that might have multiple purposes, for example, seating and other things. Can you talk to me about that?
Gladly, yes. Where the resources are as significant as this, we think that topographic changes, in particular, are challenging. On the other hand, the bollard, we have a historic bollard. We can think of it as historic. It at least refers to a language that's historic around the White House and is handsome, and we know is proven and is workable. We have another kind of bollard which has been in use now for 7 or 8 years on Pennsylvania Avenue, which we think works also. We are not compelled to change the topography of the ellipse, and our project works with existing grades. In fact, it's except for that first eastern leg, which runs at about 8%, where you have a sally port today, the gradients are really quite level, and that we think does, keeping those grades level does the least harm to the historic resource.
Mr. Friedman.
I'm going to probably ask other competitors the same question, but in your view, what is the most distinguished? You've looked at the other competitors. Yeah. What is the most distinguished thing that you're doing differently that you think sets your design apart?
With respect to the esteemed colleagues and friends who are also our competitors, it is a competition, and we are competitive. For us, it's the simplicity and the refinement of a single gesture that we think absorbs the security needs, builds on a great tradition in Washington. It's about the same dimension. It's a little bit narrower than the dimension sidewalk to sidewalk on Pennsylvania Avenue. A familiar tradition, and one that really very simply inserts itself in what we might say is the portion of this this property with, let's say, the shortest legacy, if we could say it that way.
I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you. Well, since we're talking about that, I think that is the thing to be talking about on your scheme. And so I wonder if you could talk a couple of things about the character of that bar, promenade, whatever you want. There's a couple, and specifically, I've been trying to understand between the diagrams and the illustrations, and of course, understanding that this is a bit of a moving thing. Are you talking? Some diagrams seem to indicate a street maybe lined with trees. Others where it's really like a polyculture extended across it. Mm-hmm. And I'm just, which is it? Is it one moving to the other? And then the other question I'd like to understand is, how do you see this space functioning? Clearly, seems to be a very geometrically pure insertion. And how do you see the thresholds coming into the site, working with these ideas?
Okay.
Before you start,
Gary, before you start, could I just, maybe you can, because I had a similar question, obviously, show the cross-section again, across East Street, and perhaps carry us through each layer, I think. Right, Tom? That's sort of one of the, yeah right. It was just a couple of slides in, yeah. Yeah, there, right. So could you just describe each layer of the promenade, right?
Thank you for the question. We would say this is a hybrid. This is not a unique or singular kind of typology. It takes the place that a street has for some 60 years. And so I think one can easily see this as a kind of widening of that street. That's one way to read it, and there are many ways to read it, but a widening of that street. To the left in this image surely it's plaza-like when you get to the zone which must be kept open for the area here. Exactly at the apex of the fence of the south lawn is kept free of trees. That's a requirement, that's the law, and that's an immensely supportable and important point of view. Here, back a ways, we're west, looking east, near the Butt Millet Fountain. We imagine this to be a shaded place, and as I've mentioned, this overlaps a very small portion of the ellipse, I would say, in this region right here, and in fact incorporates existing elms and other trees that are at the very northern edge of what we now think of as the ellipse. Yet there is a 27-foot wide clearance in this location, which is more than easily passable by an emergency vehicle of any size. It's a paved space, but we think it's a shaded place. Even in winter, this space would have, as some of the illustrations we've pointed to, have enormous spatial character, one that we know of as such a familiar tradition here in Washington. We think of this as a pervious pavement in places, and we've designed this so that it would be intercepting rainfall, and you can see in the illustration how that would be taken care of. With respect to the vegetation of a space like this, we do indeed see a diverse canopy here, and we see the possibility that organizing trees across this space indeed is one of the characteristics of knitting together what we know of as a fairly good canopy on the south lawn of the White House and the returning canopy, let's say, of the northern edge of the ellipse. So we would run elms and other trees, even flowering trees. You can see that we've included a bit of seasonal color here, and that's because we would see this not as a monoculture, but in fact a kind of diverse planting.
Alex, follow up?
Well, just, if I could just beg one more.
I'm sorry, do you have?
Again, could you just, in case people still don't quite understand, like the bicycles, the bollards,
Sure.
the first path, which is where the cars would also go occasionally, then, yeah, so just go through
Yes.
east to, I mean, whatever,
So south to north.
Right, yeah.
There is a width of pavement here which provides a two-way bike lane. This is also, of course, usable by walkers, joggers, and pedestrians. There is an armored line of bollards, which is the southern edge of this of the secured promenade. Then this is a passable but comfortably furnished space under the trees with benches. We encounter the Butt Millet Memorial there. And then there is a space which here again eventually is a shaded space wide enough for passage of emergency vehicles. If there was a day when E Street somehow for some reason needed to be brought back, we would say that it would be within that 27-foot wide span shown here. And then to the north of that, still another area of shade which connects exactly to the approach to the south lawn fence.
Mr. Lupke, did you have other questions?
The only question I was wondering was, as the section changes across from east to west, you said it's open at the middle. You have this
Yes.
I assume is sort of a typical section on the sides, and the only question was treating the entrances to the precinct from 17th and 15th.
Right, right. I think we would respect the continuation of sidewalk and bollarded condition along 15th and along 17th. The guard houses, the historic gates, all of that would remain in place, and this would come really up to the sidewalk and we think be an important invitation. This is really one of the signal things that it's a space that you would see from a distance on approach to this area, on approach as a visitor to the White House. Unlike my experience last night, it would seem to me that this space would give you a very clear view of where one heads to get that beautiful snapshot of the south portico of the White House.
Mr. Brown?
Yes, Mr. Hildebrand, thank you very much for your time and effort You talked a little bit about sustainable aspects and potable water. Could you talk to me a little bit about cyclic maintenance aspects as far as your design elements? And we all pray an incident never happens in this area, but if so, how procurable are the elements that you've designed as far as putting this back to its original integrity?
Ask me the last part of the question again, I'm sorry.
As far as the maintenance requirements, cyclic maintenance, those
Yes.
type of things.
Yes.
If, for instance, an incident occurs, or as new security features and things are found, how procurable are those items, and how have you thought about replacing those?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
As the design goes forward?
I think this is one of the benefits of using something of a standardized set of equipment. The bollard that surrounds this property is not a bollard that's used anywhere else, but it exists in great numbers, and so the hardening of that is a well-known thing, and over time that seems infinitely replaceable.
Mm-hmm.
We don't propose a lot of customization here, not a lot of grade change, and not a lot of new vocabulary. This is a familiar vocabulary.
Okay.
That's essential to us. In addition to that, we do think that this property should promote the best practices with respect to maintenance, and we have in our boards some indication of the economic and environmental benefits of a biological management of this reserve.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Shepard?
I'd ask if you could talk a little bit to one of the. Is that on? One of the challenges of this section as a pedestrian is when the Secret Service shuts down this section of
Yes.
road for Marine One. How does the pedestrian experience change then? How do they find their way across the property when they shut off traffic to pedestrians?
Yeah. Well, we do recognize that there are several stages to call it increased standoff. The first one is easily secured, and that is around the line of bollards. That's a managed change. It would have to be done quickly. It's clear, but we believe that would be done. Secondly, there needs to be a barrier system. We have not devised that system to be able to stand off increasingly toward the middle of the ellipse. We've not devised that, and I don't know that. Certainly don't. We're not believers in the so-called bicycle rack version. We've not designed something specific that would move that standoff distance further back, though we recognize that the landscape needs to have the flexibility to do that.
Last question for Mr. Doherty.
So if this is the front yard, where's the front gate? I mean, in terms of programmatically, where do you see the big idea sort of entrance? If you had to pick them, I get the circulation plan and all that, but where would you say that you are designing towards a principal entrance?
We think this should be very porous. We think you should be able to approach this from many places and points of view. So the promenade will be visible from a distance, maybe from the air. That's a fairly broad. It's like one of the broad streets, like Pennsylvania Avenue. We think it's clear where everyone wants to get to. That is, everyone who is visiting the White House for the first time. But in fact, this is the people's space. So approaching this from all sides and not armoring it, except in times of increased standoff, allowing the ellipse, standing in the ellipse, to feel like you are on that very special axis with the White House, the Jefferson Memorial, and close by the Washington Monument. The front yard is really the thing that we think we gain here.
And last question for Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Hildebrand. Could you explain how you envision how Sherman Park and First Division Monument Park, or the First Division area, works in terms of the how your plan differentiates where the security is currently relative to the authorized and then the public generally, and what does that hardscape look like to you in your view?
We certainly think it's very important that access to First Division Monument and to Sherman Park are rights. We need to be able to visit those memorials, and we think that access to the First Division now across that lawn should be maintained. However, the provision which is currently there, which separates that activity from West Executive, should be made permanent with a fence, and we indicate that on our plans, a hardened, historic kind of fence that would be quite easy to secure the difference between the open lawn and the monument area and East Executive and State. Similarly, we would propose a fence along the curb at Sherman Park, the outside curb, which would be adjacent to the vehicle entrance in and egress, but would allow citizens, except when under managed circumstances, security would keep citizens out of there for standoff reasons. So we envision that memorial too should be visitable, at least during the day, but separated from the secured zones by, again, the historic fence.
And as a follow-up, you see is a symmetrical sort of application for both sides?
We do, by and large, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hildebrand, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very nice presentation. And let me turn it over to Mr. Krieger to introduce the next presenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next presenters will be the Sasaki organization and their consultants, also of Watertown, Massachusetts, apparently an epicenter of design talent in this country.
I need below. Yeah. Okay, good afternoon.
Welcome.
I'm Alan Ward with Sasaki Associates, and we began the design effort with two ideas: to reconnect and to create a significant new place in Washington. By reconnect, we mean reconnect to the past, reconnect E Street through to the fabric of the city, and reconnect the White House to the ellipse and to the mall beyond. We were guided by this effort in redesign of security by a couple of principles. One was to be as simple as possible, and importantly, our aim was to be, in this age, I think most important, to be economical. So we put together a team that addresses these issues that's shown here. Sasaki has worked with RTKL on many projects in Washington, includes Dave Thompson, who has worked on a number of security projects with Department of Defense, with intelligence agencies. Includes Judy Robinson, a historian, as well as biohabitats for ecological considerations. And the balance of the team is shown here. So first, how does this scheme fit into the larger plan of the city? If you look at each of these significant landmarks with their circular geometry, each has a major gathering space associated with these landmarks. So our intention here is to create a major new civic plaza gathering space between the south end of the White House grounds and the ellipse to complement this larger city pattern. Of course, the first key to unlock this design is how does security integrate into this landscape. So our first significant kind of planning effort, working with Dave on the security plan, is to locate the sally ports at Hamilton Place, State Place, West and East Executive. Now this location at Hamilton Place frees up E Street for pedestrians and bicycles. On first impressions, it seems closer to the White House, but when you look at its relationship to other locations, for example, Pennsylvania Avenue to the north, it's the same distance or greater. So that allows then that key E Street entry for pedestrians to be free of a sally port and its associated activities. The primary entrance would be at Hamilton and State for 15th and 17th Streets, and then an exit on East Executive, West Executive. So in this scheme, we're allowing E Street to still function as a street for limited automobile traffic, for authorized vehicles exiting through security. So it remains a street in this design, albeit a transformed street. We also are suggesting rethinking the authorized vehicle circulation at the ellipse by including two-way circulation. So those vehicles pull in to parking spaces on the east side, can back in on the west side, and typically would exit south, but at peak times they also can use then E Street. So E Street has limited but authorized vehicle circulation without sally ports. Now looking more closely at the security at E Street, we aim to close the outer line of vehicular security with the least possible number of interventions. So we utilize the existing bollards at First Division Monument, the existing walls at the Sherman Memorial, introduce bollards at E Street, at the Ellipse Drive, and then planter walls on this space, and then introduce a seat wall and a bench that then relates this key central area to the space of the ellipse, integrated into the landscape design. So this overlays that security diagram on the landscape design. And then it allows us to create this significant plaza space in the center, as well as additional shaded sitting spaces on either side of the central plaza within the security zone. So looking closely at 15th and 17th Street, we tried to preserve the extension of this visual axis from the Executive Office Building south, so the sally port is west of that. It also preserves this access to the First Division Monument by pushing the parking to the west, parking to the east here. Also, this sally port at this location here and here still is 150 feet from these buildings, and the more significant threat, of course, lies along 15th and 17th Street, where it's 20 to 35 feet from the buildings. We tried to avoid this condition where pedestrians move along long lines of bollards with this sort of significant repetition by having pedestrians cross perpendicular to the few bollards here, a few here on E Street, and then planter walls here. So it kind of diminishes that effect of moving along those bollards by crossing in a perpendicular fashion. This edge along the ellipse is accomplished by a fairly subtle adjustment to the grading. This slopes from the south edge of the White House fence down along this line, so all we've done is level it to about 1% from the existing grade at the fence. It raises it 18 inches here, then added a bench height there, usable bench in this plaza. That then gives you 3 feet to the existing grade of the ellipse. So it effectively creates a usable edge, but also creates security within the design. You can see openings in that wall to access the ellipse from the plaza, and then the extension of that wall around. So the path behind this wall ascends up to 18 inches, so there's a variable height seating wall here to reach the plaza. This wall design is similar to that that's been developed for the Lincoln Memorial. This was based on a threat analysis that determined this dimension, width, and so forth to meet K-12 standards. So that's the same standards in this wall design. And what does it give you then is this openness to the plaza. You're elevated 18 inches here, gives you a slightly better view over the ellipse. Here's the openings with steps down to the space of the ellipse. Here's the path around the ellipse, and then that wall, which goes from 3 feet high to 18 inches as it drops down to meet the existing ellipse drive. Why such a plaza? When you look at what goes on there today, the significant numbers of people that are crowded against the fence. Likewise, at Lincoln Memorial, there's significant open space here, so it accommodates these crowds of people to become another great plaza space in the city. It's scaled smaller than these other examples. This is, after all, a residence, albeit an important residence. But you see the space here, these are all the same scale. At the Lincoln, it's quite a significant paved area. This is somewhat smaller than the Lincoln or the other complementary memorials, monuments. Okay, now, with the openness of that central space and that view corridor, we felt it important to create a shaded kind of counterpoint to this openness that you see here. So we call these spaces the West Grove, the East Grove, introduce new planting to create comfortable shaded sitting areas, and including a few amenities for people, including a cafe here in the West Grove with movable tables and chairs, a place to be in the shade and have a great view here on the west side towards the Washington Monument. This is slightly raised. By taking this grade, extending it out, you get a few steps here, so you're slightly elevated over the ellipse. The entrance from East Street is right by the Butt Millette Fountain as part of this seating grove. And here's the view from that slightly elevated condition in the grove. The wall, which is 18 inches high here, and then is with the path sloping, becomes 3 feet at the right-hand edge here. The eastern grove preserves existing trees and supplements those to create another shaded seating area. And here's a view looking northwest. We're coming along the ellipse walkway. That East Grove is right here. The plaza space is there, West Grove there. And once again, here's that wall between, seat wall between the plaza, the path, and the ellipse. Now, looking a little further east at where East Street meets 15th, these are the existing bicycle lanes on East Street, and we propose simply extending this configuration straight in on East Street, as well as the adjacent lanes should East Street be opened in the future. So in plan, you can see that it allows then the logical extension of East Street into the site with a moving lane in each direction, the bike lanes right down the center marked in this paving. And then those bicycle lanes extend through the center of the East Street alignment, marked in the pavement, in the plaza space as well, so you can see how East Street could be reopened rather simply in this scheme. And it is open for authorized vehicles or emergency vehicles with the guardhouse at each end. Now, looking a little beyond the East Street configuration to the larger, broader areas of the ellipse, we have recommended a few adjustments and refinements here, including adding an inner row of elm trees to reinforce the space of the ellipse because of those trees being in decline flanking the roadway. Supplementing the existing groves of canopy, shade, and evergreen trees to start to replace those aging legacy trees on the east and west panels. Helping with maintenance, with changing the grass along the eastern and western edge so there's a little less mowing required by the Park Service. Adding biofiltration in the low part of the site here. But also importantly, a slight adjustment to the grading at here, the south end. While we've held this grade, we feel there's something to be gained here And this is a grading adjustment within the zone of the walk around the ellipse and beyond the new planting of the trees which hold the existing grade. What that does for you is when you look at the plaza space at eye level and look over the ellipse, here we are at the plaza at the north end of the ellipse, here's the south end. We've raised it 3 feet in that zone. And what it does, it blocks the view of about 2/3 of a car on the ellipse drive. It blocks the view of Constitution Avenue, but still allows the motorist to have a view of the White House. So if you look at the existing condition from that plaza location, you can see how dominant those parked vehicles are, as well as Constitution Avenue beyond. So that subtle grading change then blocks most of those cars and then affects a kind of linkage between the space of the ellipse, the higher ground of Washington Monument beyond. And L'Enfant in the original plan never intended a street to be at this location. It was meant to be an extent of green space to the river and beyond without the visibility of a roadway. In terms of how events are staged in this plan, we're proposing 2 lines with sleeves to accommodate a fence, and that fence, a pedestrian fence, is useful for staging events. It also provides that periodic and episodic security required to move people to that midway point from the fence of the south grounds. This event area is consistent with the National Park Service Master Plan of 2000, and then of course the larger space is usable for the more significant events. So this is a detail of this event space with a stage usable in both directions on a lawn or by setting up seating. Okay, so how does this plan fit into the past, and how does it relate to the legacy of 200 years of design at the ellipse? So if you look at the contributing features in the nomination for the National Register listing, it includes the central axis, but also these 2 visual axes on each side from the Executive Office Building and from the Treasury Building. The one on the west extends a little further into the site. The significant structures as well as the general geometry of the ellipse. And importantly, the idea was recommended to maintain the general alignment of historic circulation and vegetative patterns. So we have followed that alignment with the redesign of East Street, although narrowing it to just 1 lane in each direction. And of course maintained these significant connectors on each side. So this is an overlay of the proposed plan with those contributing features. So to conclude, how does this design fit into these kind of key issues? How does it does achieve continuity with the past, we believe. This plan almost reiterates the plan from the past, but transforms the experience at pedestrian level. It creates a significant new space for pedestrians with this central plaza on the axis. We've tried to design it with the appropriate decorum and scale for this site. And importantly, we've aimed to achieve what we call an artful design for security that integrates security within the design, but also integrates it in a way that is simple and economical. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ward. And to task force members, we'll start the Q&A. Mr. Goney?
Did you spend much time on the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the White House to look at the bike pedestrian interaction?
Some, yes.
It's not a marked bike route, but the city has bike lanes that go right up to Pennsylvania Avenue and then continue at Vermont. So the implicit bike route is actually through Pennsylvania Avenue. And because it's not delineated, I think bikers are careful of the pedestrians, which are milling all about that street, never looking for any bike or truck or anything else that might be moving there. I like the fact very much that you provided that as much connectivity as you did with E Street, restoring a lot of its functionality, but those bike lanes down the middle of E Street where people are just trying to get the best possible photograph of themselves and their families in front of the White House could be a disaster. Someone died yesterday in the city from a collision with a pedestrian. The bicyclist died, not the pedestrian. So I was wondering if, I appreciate the continuity from Pennsylvania Avenue, but in a place that's so filled with tourists who are not paying any attention, that seems kind of hazardous. I also very much liked the use of the granite seating and the subtle changes in grade that enabled a lot of the bollards to kind of go away. In terms of the Secret Service needs for escalating security to having different perimeters, can you describe a little bit how your design might accommodate, that episodic escalation and the need for a bigger barrier, a bigger standoff distance, if it does?
Well, this barrier is designed to K-12 standards, so if the standards were greater, it would have to be adjusted, but it's the standards that have gone in a sort of common language now at the Washington Monument, is under construction at the Lincoln Memorial, and we're proposing a similar approach here. So it's consistent with that language of the 21st century and security needs of K-12 in and around this site.
Just to clarify that unlike these other monuments, the president moves, and so sometimes the activities at the White House are actually much closer to the security barrier. So anyway, our experience on E Street, and maybe that wasn't sufficiently clear in the design instructions.
Are you referring to the
fence,
the pedestrian fence that is now currently midway in the ellipse? In that one diagram that I showed with those kind of arcs, those were sleeves to accommodate the fence that could be then located to make those sort of setbacks for pedestrians.
You're actually indicating it in that drawing, correct?
No, that actually, Alex, is the fence around the National Christmas tree. Okay. And that's the White House south fence there. Yeah.
And so where would this additional fencing be? Is it visible in this diagram?
There's an arc.
Whoops. So this line, now we've shaped this so that it works with the circulation, because if you watch how it works, people are shifted from these spaces out to here. So it becomes a logical kind of path to get to here or out to here. So that's why it's shaped in this arc, but it's still at the outer line here is essentially halfway back from events on the South White House grounds. So those are those lines that are integrated into the design. And these are new walks. This is a new connecting drive here, so it kind of reiterates that new geometry laid in. A good question, thank you.
Mr. Friedman.
In that, I have two questions. In the plaza, you have this granite, and the white stripes are also granite, are they?
Yes.
And the same question I asked before, how would you looked at the other people's things, I think you've sort of answered in saying simplicity and economy. Is that?
I think that's one dimension. I think another dimension is the respect for the past. I think if you overlay this on those contributing features from earlier eras, while the experience at eye level is transformed with this new plaza space, the shaded sitting areas, this wall at the edge of the ellipse, the event area, transformation of E Street, and so forth, in actual, the plan itself is reiterating what were significant historical lines from the past. So I think that's another dimension. And also, it's not exclusive to our scheme, but the significance of this plaza space, I think, making that another great gathering space in the city like that at the Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, the future one at Union Square at the base of the Capitol.
Sure. I'm curious about that paved area. I don't know that you had a section through it, but maybe it's because it's
There was a
it's fairly simple
cross section through it. And sorry for. This is just really the section of the edge.
Okay.
This extends perhaps 3 times this width to the to the right to the grade of the existing White House fence.
And so it's open, and there's nothing in between.
Absolutely.
And this is where we would see any of all movements, really.
That's correct.
Pedestrians.
That's correct.
Bikes, but also I think one of the strengths of this scheme, of course, I think, is that it allows some idea of continuity of E Street in the long run. I mean, it's that roadway. My bigger question is having to do with the whole scope that you're proposing here generally. Is you're raising this plaza, I think, looks like it's about 18 inches, feathers out, right? Also, the ellipse generally, which is a fascinating idea. My question is, what happens at the edges? How much do you see this being having an impact on existing, for example, the areas just to the east and west of the plaza? Do you see that? Would that change, for example, the butt millet fountain? Is that going to? Are we talking about resetting these pieces, or does it change the curb or existing trees on the ellipse? What's the extent of change here?
Yeah, the trees that flank the ellipse drive are, that grade is not changed. There are a couple trees that are impacted right here with the construction of the wall in this zone here. Some trees there are already missing. So there's some adjustments to the elm planting right in this zone. But the grade of the ellipse is not changed at this end. It's changed at the south end for those design reasons that I mentioned. So the real impact on the regrading is really right here.
But as you go down the ellipse and you're building this up, what is is it only on the inside of the curb, and how are you imagining, is it a fairly, obviously it's the steepest at the furthest south,
right?
Or the greatest change.
Realize that the space across the ellipse in breadth is almost 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
So this 3-foot grade change is inside the existing inner walk, inside the proposed new elm trees, and then it slopes up at about 8%, 6 to 8%, and then feathers out into the center part of the ellipse. So it actually makes the ellipse slightly more level, more usable for recreational purposes, but it gives you that subtle adjustment to what you see from this space looking southward to block those automobiles. So it's a fairly modest adjustment.
Question, could you remind me of was there any significant impact to existing parking, either the parking scheme or the parking availability?
Yeah, we, on each of the streets, State, Hamilton, Executive, and the Ellipse Drive, we restriped all of those zones, and we came within 5 to 10% in each zone of the existing parking count. Okay. So there's a slight reduction, and that's primarily because of this zone here, the Sally ports on State and on Place, at State and at Hamilton Place.
Thank you. Mr. Shepard?
Alan, could you speak a little bit to the edge conditions on E Street at, I think, 15th and 17th?
Right. Yeah, in our view, when the pedestrian crosses 15th and 17th Street, you have visibility of 2 landmarks, the First Division Monument, the Sherman Memorial. These trees, the canopy is lifted up, you have views under the canopy, so we didn't feel it was appropriate to introduce new markers, gateways, new structures. You have these monumental landmarks identifying the beginning of the ellipse, and you have the extensive views under the trees. So we chose not to introduce new elements to mark entry or threshold. I think there's enough cues there to tell you that you're entering a special zone. And the street itself, realize we're not making a significant change there from a street environment because we're running East Street in, changing the paving. There's still broad sidewalks on either side, so it still remains a street with very limited traffic movements.
Thank you. Tom? Peter?
Yeah, I'm curious about the logic of the pattern in the paving. I mean, particularly in the plan view, it just has a very strong geometry that. I mean, I can sort of understand where those parallel or roughly parallel lines come from, but I'm interested in your thinking about that. I'm glad you brought this image up because I have a question about that sort of curb or step that we seem to see. So if you can answer those two.
The paving, we debated this at some length, and our feeling was that the walks along East Street, you're running east-west into the central space. So we wanted to perceptibly change the geometry to now be north-south to reflect the significance of this monumental axis to the Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial. So we purposefully oriented that geometry in that relationship to those monuments and to the axis. The other thing I think is a bit deceiving in plan, the reality is that even if you have significant contrasting paving colors, it's actually a fairly subtle change when actually perceived. So it's probably not going to be experienced as strong as you see it in plan. Your question about the steps here, so that's the break in the wall. We introduced 5 8-foot wide openings, 1 bollard at the base. So that creates 40 feet of openings and 3 steps, 15 or so inch steps down to the ellipse.
But closer than that, it looks like there's a curb or something.
Oh,
what is that?
Right, and this is another. We also debated whether to extend the curb through, and we thought that the paving was a powerful clue that this is a pedestrian-dominated space, but that does reflect a street section then with a curb, so that when the occasional emergency vehicle goes through, it's still within a street section. It doesn't wander elsewhere in the plaza. So that is a curb.
So it's a 6-inch change in elevation there?
Perhaps that's something in that range, yeah.
Okay, but it looks like it's dropping down as opposed to going up.
No, this is going up here. This is the southern curb line.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Mr. Goni.
I'm glad that Commissioner May raised these questions. One of the things that strikes me about your design, and you tell me if it was intentional or not, that you really do create these demarcations of different types of space. E Street remains, if you will, what Jan Gehl would call a going-through space, and that there are plenty of other places that are more hanging out spaces on the periphery, but in fact the lack of trees, the lack of shade, the fact that you envision east-west bicycle traffic going through pedestrian traffic with accommodations for seating off the street, per se, suggests that you do envision this as a going-through place with plenty of other kind of hanging out places in the periphery. Is that your intention?
No, I think the use of the space will be dominated 99% of the time by the significant groups of people gathering here. I think you'll see groups of people getting their photographs in front of the Washington Monument, milling about here. The number of vehicles that actually go through here and bicycles, I think, is quite limited. So it's predominantly for pedestrians and will be used predominantly by pedestrians. But we want these other measures there so that you demarc where vehicles are allowed to go and where they are not kind of allowed to intrude on strictly pedestrian spaces. There also is a First Amendment gathering space that's in the program, which is from the street line south, still leaves a gathering space in front of the fence for other visitors.
Mr. Chairman, can I just a detailed question now. At the kind of the west end and east end where those groves, those bollards in East Street would have to be demountable, right?
That's correct, for emergency vehicles.
Yeah, but according to Secret Service, that's a kind of daily activities. Is that right? There are cars there on a daily basis?
It is now.
Yeah, so, okay, so those bollards would
That's
have
correct.
to come. Okay.
That's correct. And there is a guardhouse right there next to that southern sally
No,
port.
no, I meant actually inboard of that.
No, but there's a sally port at the
Yes.
southern end here,
Yeah.
which has visibility of the
Right.
bollards right there, to control the retractable bollards.
And last question to Mr. Brown.
Could you walk me through your the plaza as well as the rest of your site and how you approached accessibility as far as
Sure.
the integration of that throughout the areas?
ADA accessibility? Sure,
Accessibility,
sure.
yes.
Let me find a plan here. Well, if you look closely at the plan, and it's in real detail here, actually, we have shown a curb, but we also have shown ramps, ADA ramps at each location, at each crosswalk along E Street. So it's a conventional street design where you have accessibility at the crosswalks here, as you move through. I'm not sure that we've shown it right here and at the plaza space. And we debated whether this curb was necessary or not. And it could be that could be a traffic table at this location, to allow crossing there. So there's probably, further design consideration of where all those crossings should occur. But for the most part, they're all shown with ADA ramps in all of these zones where there are street designs.
Okay. And as far as entering the lawn area, you talked about the 40 feet of open space and those.
Right.
And you talked about steps. How would.
Right. So those are steps there, and then it meets grade right here.
Okay.
And right there. And of course, the entire then balance of the path is accessible.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ward, very
Okay,
much.
thank you.
Very good, very good. And Mr. Krieger? Use your microphone.
I'm pleased to invite Cisco to make their presentation, and I should learn how to use the mic.
Thanks.
Mr. Hood, welcome.
Welcome, Mr. Chairman, jury members. It's a pleasure to have submitted for such a pristine and challenging competition. We are pleased to submit our ideas to you today, and I'd like to sort of start not with security, but to sort of start with the place itself. And hopefully you will see how the security issues sort of unfurl themselves or literally manifest themselves to the way we've thought about this important spot and place, and most particular, a place of residence within the national capital. Over the last 20 years, I've come to DC off and on, and for various things, and I call myself a jogger at times, so I go running in the morning, and I run down the mall, and I run up the Lincoln Memorial steps, and I read the second inaugural address. It's one of those amazing things that make me feel like an American. But on my way, I always stop in front of the White House. And over the last 20 years, I've really felt a power to be able to stand there and imagine what's going on inside. And that's something that every American citizen should have that right to do. Free of barriers, free of harassment, but that kind of scale, that scale of a yard, the scale of a private residence, of a person living there, the president and his family. And that's something that we've attempted to do in our scheme, is to try to build on that sensitivity, but also on that history where at one point in time, as you can see in those early images, people could walk right up to that doorstep. But this notion of a plural society and a democracy, it does suggest that we have to make choices. And we'd like to sort of introduce the term of hybridity. And we think that the public landscape of America is a hybrid landscape. It has to do many things. We're different people, shapes and sizes, colors, race and culture, and it has to facilitate us. And in the national capital, we have issues that we have to basically mitigate, but we also have to understand that we still have a polis, a public to deal with. And we'd like to suggest this idea of a palimpsest, that here in this country, instead of wiping things clean, reorganizing our lives over and over and over again, that struggle to basically think of it as a palimpsest. Great civilizations always honor the past, but they move forward. And we'd like to suggest that we can build upon what's there without erasing it totally, but weaving and imagining a new future and a new place for the front of the White House. We understand security is very important. The last 10, 12 years have taxed our nation. And the rise in security elements in our environment, people and objects, is something that we have to take very serious. And part of this mandate of this competition is to really think about an effective security for the White House and its grounds, to reiterate, to minimize those conflicts of traffic, and to create an attractive environment and try to make something out of those things. And we think that there could be a dynamic social space emerge through these three things. Not looking at them singularly, but looking at them as integrated elements that give rise to something new, that can speak to this epoch, that can speak to who we are today. So 100 years from now, someone can look back and go, well, they had this time period where they were faced with these things, and look how they came out of it. So first, to talk about the history, because I do think that's important, and that's not to belittle the security, but if you can sort of see Washington, D.C., through the ages, through the palimpsest, we can begin to understand Downing and those early plans where he talked about this notion of this promenade, this landscape that's directly in front of the White House, this idea that the president can stand at the terrace and look out, and this landscape can stretch out before it. But over time, other ideas about this landscape emerge. And they not only change those things before them, but they add something new. Maybe axial relationships, maybe mall relationships, maybe strengthening how we move through the space. And so by the time we get to the space, it's a little bit of everything, right? It does this, it does that, but it doesn't really hold itself. So how do we take this and harness it? And we suggest that if you zoom out and you look at that historical palimpsest, one of the things that continues over and over is the ability to access each place and move. And that's actually my running route. Just kidding. That's actually a way of moving, but that porosity of moving through these circuits. And that's something I think that's special about DC. The access is always there, but the ability for you to move almost unfettered through the landscape is a powerful thing. And the greens, they're large, they're small, sometimes they're in between spaces, but you can always get off of the circuit and find another space. So this idea of sampling Downing is the way we're doing it. And sampling, like in music, like in science, taking a lot of things and putting them together in new ways. And can we take this idea of the landscape, of the circuit and movement, and arrive at a new way to do it? And can we do it in place of security walls, fences, and gates? And here what we're showing is how that palimpsest comes together, where we have a set of garden circuits that basically take us along East Street and connect us to the enhanced side panels that we see here, that also connect us to the articulated urban squares, which I think are very important to East Street, how you arrive at the place. The square has the ability to take you around its perimeter, and introducing a new porch. And we're taking the historical idea of a ha-ha wall, which basically separates two spaces but flattens out the middle ground and actually allows those two geometries to read clear. This idea is not a new idea. We were shown these early pictures looking out from the balcony out to the ellipse and then out to the mall, and this idea of taking that middle ground and trying to blur the distance between the two. One, as you stand at the fence or stand at the ellipse looking at the White House, by bringing the middle ground or erasing it, the White House would come forward, and in opposite, the actual ellipse would move backwards. And this is a very simple idea that we're trying to sort of deal with. The double circle that related to that early history, how can you take that and actually begin to create something anew? And so here we have the two circles, one of the ellipse and one of the south lawn. And then we have ours, the concavity, looking back towards the ellipse, a lookout. But can we then turn it on its head and actually have Prospect and Refuge, a place where citizens can actually sit and look back at the White House while citizens are also looking back towards the ellipse? And so the wall becomes this piece that also provides the security, but also provides a place and a new element for people to remember and to gather. And here is a perspective showing that East Street continues through. We see the south lawn of the White House out with the fence, and we see this new wall that splays out almost like a new headdress that allows people to come up and look at the ellipse, but also gives you safety away from the circuitry so that you can actually stand back and view the White House. And there's an image of a ha-ha wall at the top. And here's a closer view of that. Most of our design looks at the 2000 comprehensive plan and suggests that long-term there will be an underground parking, but short-term we can actually move some of the vehicular, take some of the parking from the ellipse and actually have that as a roadway. And what you're looking at here is the wall right at that edge. We have a 25-foot separation between the bollards and this new wall. On one side is 36 inches high on the downside, so it's actually serving as our barrier. From above, it's less than 30 inches, so that the fall is not great and there's no need for a rail. So it's actually trying to work with the grades. There's some fill and some cut in certain areas. So moving to security. Now that we have an understanding of how we arrived there, the idea of security, standing back and looking at Pennsylvania Avenue here to the top, we thought it should be very clear as you move from Pennsylvania Avenue all the way down to East Street where that perimeter is. And so we're suggesting that we use the same treatment on the ground surface on Pennsylvania Avenue as this threshold condition, the stone that comes in. So they're almost like small blankets of paving that come in along the sally ports. And as you're moving along the edge streets, you know that you're arriving at this different precinct. Here we have three different ideas that speak to security. The first is threshold. And using Sherman Park as the example on one side, we can see that from the street edge, we have the first threshold, which is a queuing, the second threshold, which is basically the security checkpoint, third threshold, which allows you the freedom to then go towards the White House. We're using architecture and urban design as a way to punctuate the square. As I talked about the public square as this element, this typology in the city that allows you to basically use its circumference. So we're really taking East Street away and really making the street around the squares read. You can still move through East Street, but from a morphological sort of point of view, a structural point of view, you come in and you move around the square and you move out. And pretty much the queuing, the way it is today, stands in place. Sorry, I've been using this one, so you can sort of see it here, now moving back around. And thirdly, this idea of traffic calming and barriers, and really thinking about the bollards not as something that is stopping you, but is slowing things down. And so I think the percentage of use of the bollard, their placement, really maximizing sight lines and how one moves around begins to suggest a very strict and direct way of thinking about security. And you can see here the paving, north and south, east-west Sallyport, that comes back around on both sides. We have security bollards here. We have the canopy. We have two out stations along here for K9, as well as for security checkpoints. The fences are still intact here. Our bollards come straight down along this edge back down to the wall of the ellipse, and the actual ha-ha wall forms that southern border. And then looking back out, we can begin to see that ha-ha wall again as it becomes the seat where we have a monument, and then it becomes wall and overlook in the middle. We see E Street continuing through, and we see the circuits allowing you to get up close to the fence. And here to take you through the sequence of the urban design, again, the queuing, inspection, you proceed, you turn, open gate, and you move through. Sight lines, making sure all have 360 sight lines. This would be redundant on both sides as well. And then easy access, opening up some of the pathways to allow you access to get back down to the ellipse. These would all be movable bollards, operable bollards that's operated from a manned station on one side. And then looking at where those barriers and bollards are located to make sure they reinforce the queuing as well as the various stations. And this is a close-up of the Sallyport East, seeing Kiosk 1, the authorized secured parking area, and then the waste disposal K9 Kiosk 2. And this happens in both sides. Along that guardhouse, we're suggesting there's a wall that runs, a low wall that runs along this edge, and then there's a planting strip, and then there's a sidewalk, and a typical bollard detail. And then the event typologies from First Amendment, really filling the ellipse, to small tourist photo ops, pageant of peace, just places where we think people will be attracted. As you visit the White House, you queue next to the fence. And then Marine One, being able to secure bollards out a third of the way across the ellipse, connecting back to the wall and the bollards that we have in place. And then lastly, the dynamic social space that evolves out of those things. I think that's the 1.5 minute. This new porch that creates this front yard, that the automobile is taken away from that middle long term. You will have the loop roads on both sides. The pedestrian is able to move in many of the places, as well as the bicycle in striped and designated areas. And then looking at that planting plan and layout close up. Here is the first phase where we suggest if the parking garage is not built, the road could be moved inside, the wall could be put in place. And then our planting plan that reinforces some of Downing's earlier ideas for a native garden and swale options on the side panels. We would collect most of our water down to the south edge, and we would begin to introduce these smaller gardens on the side panels, allowing the full ellipse to breathe. And lastly, talking about those materials, we'd like to suggest that we use two types of materials. One, stone that we see everywhere, pretty much throughout Washington, D.C. And this stone would be some taken from the Potomac to sort of serve as palimpsests for the road that used to be up against the fence. Secondly, the granite pathways and the granite paving that we see on Pennsylvania Avenue. Sorry. And then we have the wall condition, which would be made of stone as well. And then we have the lighting. And the lighting turns the strategy less on the bollards, but turns more onto how do we take this ubiquitous element that we see that's plentiful and begin to sort of add the optimistic to it. And so looking at your light, you have a Federal bollard light that has a little hat on it. We were really interested in how you were taking some of the existing features and transforming them. So we're suggesting casting some of these elements and actually having them as light-lit elements. And the one along the ha-ha wall would actually be 50 of them, that when the president looks out, the Union is safe, it's an optimistic place. You could come and actually find your state, get your photo op taken there. But this notion that this ubiquitous element that's actually stopping things actually begins to celebrate who we are and where we are. And the use of glass in certain areas for our canopy areas, for shading, that actually also has embedded within it fiber for shading. And then lastly, the drainage, where we're pretty much, again, grading the top out level, collecting water actually within the circuits themselves, within the depressions along the edge of our circuits. We're actually collecting water up at the top, allowing it to hold, and then releasing it to the bottom. And dealing with your steam pipe insulation issue, doing research to actually relay that out, wrap it, and make sure that we can actually grow things on top of it. But this idea of reintroducing and using these elements and surfaces that we see in DC in a totally new ways to give us a new set of surfaces and elements and typologies. And in the end, this hybrid scheme will allow us to move forward into the future by bringing the past along, but actually finding new ways and new things to celebrate who we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hood, very much. Members of the task force, questions? Mr. Lukey.
Yeah, I'm actually glad we're on this image because I'm trying to understand the, can you tell me in that middle ground where there's a vehicle at the left, and then that, how does it, tell me where are we cutting? What?
He is down this, well, this person is
White
down
House is to the
below.
right.
White House is here. This is down at the ellipse.
Is that actually the point where
That's the tight
of
pinch point.
tangency, where
Yes.
everything comes together? Okay, so, and in the scheme with the depressed roadway, the assumption is still that this is only, what would be the use that would occur in the roadway?
For the ellipse or for the upper?
Where you see that,
Down here?
that vehicle?
In the interim, you would still have parking. We were taking out a third of the parking to the north to accomplish this move, and we basically would readjust the road to the inside parking lane. And so what you're seeing is a car coming along that inside lane, and we have the marker is located right here.
So, because I think one of the dreadful characteristics right now is the sort of this security no man's land, and so I guess what you're saying is that this is actually a roadway that is returned in a way to public use.
Yes.
Parking. I mean, it's controlled, but you still have parking, and it's possible to walk across.
In the
there.
interim of your comprehensive plan, if the garage never gets done, you would basically have a path or road moving along here one way. That would then allow for that 3-foot wall to raise up and to have the 25-foot path that goes along the top.
And right at that point of tangency, what happens?
Right at this point of tangency, you're closest to the fence. Is that what you mean by what happens? And there is an overlook condition, right? So you can stand there and look out towards the ellipse. There's no seating or anything like that. So let me get to an image.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a lot going on here. And I'm trying to figure out what your big move is. I mean, I get that the big idea is hybridity, but there's a lot going on, I think. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Back to an image. Well, let's start with this image here. I mean, pretty much our scheme along East Street, I think the largest move is returning East Street back, building this porch or wall along this edge here. Pretty much all of this is left intact with the exception of planting. The sally ports along here are articulated, and these loop, the way you move right now, is basically preserved.
So this, I have to admit, I've never heard of a ha-ha wall. It's just I'm kind of intrigued by it. So this point where the ha-ha wall meets the axis, you know, the fountain. This, I guess, we're at an axial point. Is that sort of the center of the universe for this? Do
No,
you
not
imagine?
particularly. I guess if you look at it in plan, one would think that that would be, you know, that's a major point, but it's a point in passing. If you're moving through, it's the closest you are to the fence, right?
Yeah.
But I would imagine this is the place where people are probably going to stand to get their picture took. But what we've done is these two side pieces here, we've provided almost a release. So imagine when you go through a kind of a compressed point, there's this release that's happening on both sides. And that release hopefully is where people will want to be to a certain degree because we're providing amenities for them there. Visually, as you look across, looking down East Street, there will be that 24-foot pinch point. From a pedestrian point of view, it's still pretty broad. You know, from an emergency point of view, moving across, there's a space for 2 people. One of the things that, again, I was very interested in was this idea of, as you're moving through, creating spaces that had a very particular logic to them and a scale to them. And so this is the tightest of all the spaces. Again, the scale of the ellipse, when you're out there, it's almost, you can't even comprehend it. So for us, this notion of the bench, the porch, these smaller spaces creates this kind of tangible, more intimate thing, but they're not that large. They just happen for a split second.
Mr. Friedman.
Actually, we've used these ha-ha walls before, including at the Washington Monument. There's quite a number of them. No, I believe it's a historic landscape with the ha-ha walls. It's a very old thing. We used to keep horses in.
Yes.
Sheep in, excuse me.
Horses, sheep.
Sheepish people. So my normal question is how you think you're distinguished from your competitors. And I also want to editorial, I don't want to lead you to your answer, but I do think that the idea of the lighted bollards, if Secret Service lets you do it, is a very exciting idea. And takes a negative piece of our landscape and makes it a very positive and exciting and joyful experience. I'm impressed with that idea.
To answer your question about the thing that distinguishes our scheme, I would say there's not one thing. I would say the way we like to work is as if this had happened over 20 years, right? This notion, again, of instead of going in and making something just appear brazenly new, can you go in and do smaller things that add up? And I think our scheme distinguishes itself because it hits many different sort of points of logic about design and place. And it adds not big things, I hope, but small things enough to kind of trigger them and change them. And so at the end of the day, you'll come through and there's something that will be familiar to you, very familiar, but something quite different, right? That you would still move through the pathways to a certain way. You will still have that logic of roadway, but you might run upon a seat that's 100 feet long all of a sudden, or you might find yourself perched up 18 inches higher overlooking the ellipse. Or you might find yourself in another space of the ellipse because we've made it, more convenient socially for you through planting, through scale, through access.
Mr. Chairman.
The design has both been described as a lot of things going on, and also, as you just said, a lot of small things that add up. Would you describe this as a simple design or a somewhat complex design?
I would describe it as a simple design.
Simple design. Mr. Krieger.
Yes. Walter, 2 questions related to the ha-ha wall. It's clear how you move east to west in relationship to it. If you're scrolling through the ellipse, starting Constitution Avenue, just wandering through the ellipse, how do you actually get up to the fence of the south fence of the White House?
If you're on the ellipse itself, let's say you're playing ball,
or if you wanted to just walk up the axis,
or you're wandering, you would come this way, move along here,
you'd go around the ha-ha wall.
Yes,
right.
you would come up here, and we did that purposely to sort of hold that national Christmas tree and the marker again, almost like embracing it, and really deflecting people back out at this diagonal and giving them many different choices to move back in that way.
Okay. And could you describe then that sort of second security line, where the ha-ha wall stops, right? There are bollards that move across the landscape.
Yes.
Yeah, there.
The bollards would move along from here all the way back up, along to here and here.
And they seem to turn inward, no?
They would turn along.
No, into the fence, say?
Up here, yes.
Okay,
yeah, on both sides. Yes, ma'am.
Could you describe both the pedestrian and the bicycle circulation
Yes.
here, especially on the mostly east-west? I understand there are lots of ways people could meander around, but if it was people were using it to get east and west, how are they coming?
Primarily, we've enlarged the sidewalks next to Sallyport East, Sallyport West, and there would be designated bike lanes along this side, coming into East Street, and then here, moving down to the lips, we've designated these as bike paths as well, along here and here. And then you could come into the ellipse.
And then you designated that as kind of a granite paving material, and it's and next to it is this permeable grasscrete. Is that?
The grasscrete is basically where you have this porous paving right now. That's picking up the leftover edge of the street next to the fence up here. So that's where people are not passing, walking along here. That pathway is still next to the fence along here.
Okay, thank you.
And can you say a word or two about the ADA compliance?
Pretty much curb cuts on most of the corners where we have raised curbs, moving through fairly level across here along the porch. The overlooks, you could get right up to this edge looking back out. Accessibility all the way back down, curb cuts all the way back through, accessibility through the two side gardens as well.
Mr. Friedman.
Can you show me on that slide where the lighted bollards would be?
They would be along the top of the wall, right along here.
Thank you.
And at the various Sallyport entrances here, at the edge of the gate here, at the edge of the gate here, the ones on top of the wall.
Mr. Krieger.
Could you describe, in addition to light bollards, I meant to ask this all along, kind of some of the other kind of feature, lighting, seating, and also the spots in the where the subport, the material changes that cause the spots to happen. Could you say something about that?
Yes, pretty much using your two types of lights. I think you use the double head along the edge, the single lantern along the middle ellipse and along the edges here. The lit bollards along the top of the wall, along this edge here. At the Sallyport, lighting along this edge, the single head lanterns along that edge. Within the actual side panels, there would be the single lantern as well.
And now the pattern, the surface pattern.
The surface pattern along here, this would be typically the paving that's existing today within the ellipse, which would be the granite pavers. Along the Sallyport, north, south, east, and west, we're basically taking the same type of paving you see on Pennsylvania Avenue, making that pattern appear along the sides.
And just one more. The area between the fence. Sorry, just one more. The area between the fence, right there. Yes.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
This would be very beautifully washed river stones from the Potomac. Meridian Hill Park uses a lot of the stone in its aggregate, but we're suggesting instead of the grasscrete that's manufactured to actually use the local stone and actually create a porous paving. And this picks up the historic road that used to turn along this way. Right now, I think you have grasscrete in it. You can actually see the edges of that road that used to be there.
So I wish I had a pointer, but just so I understand sort of the hierarchy, because I think the paving speaks to that progression of elements. You've got the Sallyports are basic. Did you say that those are really coming from the vocabulary established on Pennsylvania Avenue?
Yes.
And the East Street, I think I understand, is the granite or the
Yes.
pedestrian thing. The circle you just said is the washed
Here,
stone. Yes. What happens at the porch and those? What did you describe the garden circuits? That's I'm trying to understand the hardness, the experience of it.
Well, the wall is made of granite, and it's made of granite in slices. It's cut 1 meter thick, and they're actually parametrically cut. So in section, the wall is this really heavy piece of granite that comes out of the granite path is next to it, but we also have panels of lawn on both sides. This is the typical granite paving that we have in the ellipse that's running next to it, the kind of dark and the light color. Along the roadway, this would still be in its current condition. This would be asphalt. Over time. If it becomes a path, it would change over to the same paving as well.
What happens what are those undulating zones between the overlook exactly in there?
In here?
Yeah.
This becomes a seat. This is a seating area right here, and there's a seating area right here. So the wall actually becomes a bench at that point.
I guess because it undulates between what appears to be a few feet and maybe tens of feet, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
There's a...
Here you can actually see it. You can see the bench rising up here, and a bench rising up here, and in here it slopes up a foot and it becomes a ramp.
So the whole thing is actually a stone manipulated surface with perhaps...
This would be the stone manipulated here. This would be the stone pavers here, the grass panels located here. As you get closer to the fence, it would be then the porous paving.
Thank you.
And the last question from Mr. May.
Actually, my last question was what Mr. Lubke was asking. I was trying to figure out what that undulating stuff was.
Yeah,
so.
it's granite. Yeah, solid.
Thank you, Mr. Hood, very much.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to invite Michael Van Valkenburg Associates from New York, and I still like to think of them from Boston as well, to come and make their presentation.
Thank you.
I have to admit I was power eating a cookie. Not needed in the big picture of things, but definitely necessary this afternoon. But I want to start by saying that we're incredibly honored to be here this afternoon, and I wanted to take a moment in the beginning of the presentation and introduce the team. We were the designers of Pennsylvania Avenue on the north side of the White House, and one of the things that we learned in the process was that the winning scheme is a point of departure. And the team that we had working with us made a very big difference in our ability to navigate the events that were required. So I'm going to ask the members of our team that are here today to stand up. Rod Mercer and Beth Kapelos from URS. They are our security engineers. And Susan Turner, who's not here today, is our landscape historian. She contributed significantly to this book on the White House. We feel lucky to have Ethan Carr, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, who will help us train both as a historian and as a landscape architect on how aspects of our design would impact the approvals process as it's moving forward. And Eric T. Fleischer would address sustainability. And then I wanted to also say that Beyer Blinder Bell, the DC office, who worked with us, Hani, would you stand up, please? They worked with us also on the Pennsylvania Avenue project. They would be rejoining us. And then in terms of the MVVA team, Laura Solano is, along with Matt Urbanski and myself, we're principals of Michael Van Valkenburg Associates. And if we were selected in this process, Laura and I would share the same role as last time, where I'm the sort of leader of the design, and Laura makes it real and puts it in the ground and makes it happen. Andrew Gutterman, as we said, who's not here today, would be our project manager, and Andrew worked with me on our work at Wellesley, which is an Olmsted Brothers landscape just outside of Boston, restoration project. And Chris Donahue would be the project designer working with me. He's currently a part of our team on the Jefferson National expansion in St. Louis. And Emily Vogler, staff landscape architect, is working in the context of a historical landscape at Princeton. And finally, of course, I would be part of the team as well. I have been working with the team on all of these projects, but particularly around the idea of reinvigorating historic landscapes in the work that we've been doing in Harvard Yard. So to quickly go through our goals, we were committed to the idea that there would be a permanent and appropriate security infrastructure that clearly separates vehicles from pedestrians at all times, and that does not mean that at certain moments in the daily life of this place it would be necessary to erect other temporary devices to control the separation of people from cars. Also critical to our scheme is one of seeing that the landscape that stretches from the White House to the mall is a continuous garden, and that the security elements to every degree possible use landscape and low plantings as a means of diminishing the presence of those elements on the south side of the White House. And that all of the work that we would do takes strong inspiration from the history of the site, the formative ideas that Thomas Jefferson had about the relationship that the president's house should have to the people. Of course, Downing's 1851 plan for the ellipse, and the work of the Olmsted Brothers, especially is commemorated in the 1935 report on the grounds of the White House that he presented to the president at that time. Our concept comes down to one simple conceptual idea, which is that as Jefferson imagined, the White House has a front, like most houses in America had at the time, that faces a street, and that the south side faces a garden, and that the configuration of the South Park and the landscape of the grounds of the White House are seamlessly experienced as one romantic landscape. We're very concerned with using landscape and elements of site design to diminish the sense of the site as being secured. Central to that, we're here at 15th Street and East Street, is the creation inside and beyond the entrance to East Street, an arrival plaza or a small arrival space at the beginning of the south landscape. That through a very frugal approach to security, the opportunity is afforded to reinvigorate the ellipse as a public garden. The dispirited nature of the ellipse today is to us as visually disconcerting as the character of East Street and the security elements that are there. And so we've tried to come up with a very frugal scheme that allows the entire area, the entire 55 acres, to be reimagined. And that this that this Jefferson idea of a singular landscape, of a continuity from the White House to the mall, is reinvigorated in this process. I think if there's one thing that all of the schemes share, and ours is no different, is that there is a moment of truth in this project, which is what you're going to do at this very formally difficult moment where the ellipse landscape meets E Street and then allows sight lines into the White House. And we were not dissimilar from our competitors in making this a focus of our presentation to you today. But ultimately, because we were unable to completely separate pedestrians from vehicles, and because we realized by reading the brief that E Street can be narrowed and significantly return to the character that it had when originally planned in the early part of the 19th century, that this afforded us an opportunity to use very slight reconfigurations of topography, walls more so than bollards, but specifically the notion of very low plantings and garden gates as the primary means of separating people from cars and to controlling points of access from south to north and north to south. So I'll go through this as quickly as I can, but we're significantly keeping the idea of the street alignment. The major change is that we're reducing E Street from 4 lanes to 2, and this affords us approximately 20 additional feet north to south to widen the gathering area outside of the south lawn and to create a new gathering area at the north end of the ellipse. Vehicular circulation remains significantly the same. We are separating maximally pedestrians from vehicles. The security elements are significantly embedded in low plantings, and I want to make clear that these are not decorative plantings. These are not flower beds. These are not perennials. These are using the elements of a garden to keep the south landscape as a garden. We also, which has worked really well through history, are using gates to be the elements that allow Secret Service to make it clear to the public whether the place of passage is open or not open. This is the combination of those elements as a composite. You can see, for instance, on the right over here, where 15th Street and E Street intersect, the creation of the small entry plaza and then the meandering path that begins to create a way for crossing from 15th Street to 17th Street and vice versa, choosing about halfway across to either cross nearly perpendicular to E Street and go to the edge of the grounds of the White House, or to cross into the northern end of the ellipse. In terms of the restricted zones, they're very clear that at each instance they use gates that take the pedestrian circulation moment and uses those to create a higher gradient of security depending on the activities in the White House. So in terms of circulation by phase, we have the existing condition, we have the scheme that I've just described, but our scheme also believes that the best idea for this area is the National Park Service master plan, that when the fiscal woes of the current government are settled, and someday it's sensible that the as master planned underground garage should still be created, and that would be the final step in this sort of emancipation of the landscape on the south side of the White House and returning it to the people. The landscape garden breaks down into 3 pieces: traditional public gardens in the irregular style of Downing. I happen to love irregularity, so it's not somehow strange to me that, you know, the plantings would somehow follow that idea that he had. as we've said, the low plantings near the gates of the White House, and then the restored lawn at the middle. The character of the landscape on the south side would be very reminiscent of this rendering. I thought the question and answer periods were challenging but very revealing, and so I'm finishing 2 minutes early. I expect bonus points for that. But I thank you for having us here today, and I also want to say that I'm extremely honored to be among this group of other 4 competitors that we're getting to see the work of today. It's an extraordinary group and many friends in the peanut gallery over there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And task force members. Mr. Goni?
Could you walk me through the bike circulation for this plan? Sorry to keep asking.
You really sprang that on me. You haven't asked anybody else about that issue. The idea of the bike circulation is that they are, I'm going to go back, I can do it right here, but the idea of the bike circulation here is that they join a widened path of, at the northern end of the ellipse. So we've taken some of this dimension that we have collected by narrowing East Street by 2 lanes to make all of the areas between the southernmost point of the White House landscape and the beginning of the ellipse to slightly upsize all of the passageways here. And we see this as an area of slow biking and mixing bikers with pedestrians at the northern edge of the ellipse.
And what's the width of that path? That you've created, the new path. You've narrowed the East Street to 2 lanes, and you're continuing to allow secure vehicular traffic. But what do we have left then? What are you adding to the paths?
So, Emily, each time that she asked the question about bicycling, I said she would ask how wide the path is, and you said 20 feet, right? Thank you.
Mr. Lukey.
Yeah, I appreciate your couple things, particularly this question of the residence, the president's residence, as it actually was originally known, as having a front and a rear, and the opportunity about the garden treatment is a very good point. Also, narrowing in on this, everything, as you say, converges on the pinch point, and
right.
Yours is no exception. Can you talk about, you have the axis, which we understand is a visual thing, but can you talk about the experience of where these things come together, the passage of the pedestrian, these low plantings with the security embedded into it, the surrounding garden-esque treatment, and then particularly, I don't really understand this diagram, what that passage into the open ellipse, what is happening in that sort of bow tie shaped and immediately south, because this is really so critical to the way these different components of the landscape that you're proposing, they all come together right there, and I'm trying to imagine the experience.
Okay, so each of you, where you're sitting at present, can only see the person at the other half of the half circle from roughly here down, because the designers of the space chose to make a solid element. So the critical idea is that we're doing something extremely similar to that, which is that this series of necessary security elements come along with a low planting element that effectively reduces the sense of security, but also means that the widened areas of paving are made exceptionally less visible in space. In other words, from where you're sitting sir, you not only can only see half of the gentleman in the lovely purple shirt, but you can't actually see the area behind his chair either. And so you gain, well, you're from the Fine Arts Commission, you know this stuff. But you hope you, he hopes he does. But by creating a series of low veils, you obscure the planting elements, and you also optically diminish the width of the enlarged paving areas that are there, coming much closer to maintaining this pastoral sense of garden continuity in that area. So if you look straight down, which nobody will ever do, because I can assure you an airplane is never going to get that near the White House. But the fact of the matter is, if you look straight down, the separating elements are quite narrow, and the paved areas, the road widths that we've taken away from E Street have been added to make all of the gathering areas more generous. But because of the way perspective works in space, the dividing elements which obscure the security elements also give you the sense of much narrower gathering areas on the other side.
And that all makes sense. I guess I'm actually talking about more of a pedestrian. I mean, this is all reasonable, and it actually speaks to the, probably to some extent, the idea of a ha-ha also, that get a more continuous idea of the landscape. But I'm trying to understand from that diagram what you've got the roadway of the ellipse, and it seems to narrow down adjacent to that darker bow tie shape.
That's exactly right.
And what is the passage, if any? Is it to the either side of that bow tie from the roadway? I'm just trying to understand, how would you move through this landscape literally? I just don't understand it physically.
So you're at 15th Street and you come.
You need to use the microphone.
Don't do that.
We can give you a handheld just coming to you.
No, that's okay. I'll do it from here. So depending on whichever side you come in on, you leave the street, you come into a widened path, and here you make a choice. You either cross E Street, which is signaled with bollards and gates, and go to the White House, or you cross the one-way circulation in the ellipse, join the pedestrian system, and continue on out the other side. Or, of course, you can come to here, cross, and go in that. And I know in the walks that I like to do every day, this sense of having choice and creating a meander makes actually walking pleasant. Like you do it differently each day.
And that area that is white with the little green, that's actually all pedestrian, somehow a little bit more
and
open.
Those little spots are careful expansion of the paving around the enormous elm trees that are there. So the canopy of these trees have not been drawn, but these are existing trees. And this paved area is under the kind of spreading extent of the elm trees that exist in that area.
I have a question. I missed the part. I see them on the diagram with these garden gates. Can you talk about the gate idea a little bit? I mean, are these real physical gates that, or are they the ones with the? Is that this?
Well, those are larger gates because those are at a very major security point, and they probably would. Those would be required to have K-12 rating. The other garden gates,
The smaller ones.
are really garden gates because the security element is provided by the bollards that also signal the moment of passage from a pedestrian area to the cartway. And they show up on the on those little. For instance, you can see that here.
Where? I mean, you have them.
So
you
here's
talk
what-
about these garden fences.
Yeah, here is a place where one of the gates would occur, and there are a series of them. Every time a pedestrian area reaches, either a place where you're crossing a vehicular way, or secondarily where these zones of security pulling away from the White House are created, wherever those are, those moments of security recognition are provided by gates. They don't have to have the high level of, in other words, they don't have to look as armored as providing the highest level of security, but they use the language of a garden to be the device that says to the public, this path is closed. So a security officer would presumably, depending on the moment of security, go and close those gates. And the design of those would be, a sensitive issue.
The other question I had was about the trees, the species of trees. This looks a lot like the Boston Common public garden, kind of, especially the shop that's right behind you. And so this is a lot of years hence, I would imagine. Or have you, it looks like you're really, to create the canopy, you're going to have to do some serious waiting. What do you think? Can you talk to me? I'm not a plant guy, so I don't know about these things.
Honestly, I think that there is such frugality in our scheme with respect to reusing many of the elements that are there that the equivalent budget allocation would allow moving significant sized specimens. I don't know if you have been given a copy, all of you have been given a copy of the Olmsted Brothers report on the grounds that I mentioned in the beginning, but literally, except there was not terrorism as we know it in 1935, nearly every issue that you guys have raised is addressed by Olmsted in terms of the grounds, but he understands in this report that the south landscape is part of the borrowed landscape of the White House grounds, and that's significantly motivating to us that while we want the public to still feel that sense of visual connection with the White House, and for us it is primarily symbolically visual, that the people's landscape and the president's landscape connect visually. And the point of connection is not celebrated. Our attempt is to erase that point of connection. So in the issue of scale, there is the skeleton on site today of a once wonderful landscape. And I think, as Gary talked about, by a different approach to soil management and T. Fleischer's role on our project of reinvigorating the condition of those trees, that you could do something that would be fairly wonderful fairly quickly here with respect to the character. We're thinking, it does feel a little bit like the public garden in Boston, and that is historically the right period. We were trying to also reflect the feeling of the Vassar campus, which President Vassar had a major landscape designed by Downing, and of course we all know Downing died very unexpectedly, actually traveling to Washington to present about his work on the mall. But the Vassar landscape is one of our best ideas of what the Downing landscape was supposed to look like. Although there are gardens of his that still exist, there are extremely few public landscapes because of the shortness of his life.
Mr. Brown?
Thank you.
If we could go back to the along East Street at the pinch point, if you could...
You want me to, you think it's back here?
That's fine.
This is good?
This is good. Talk to me about the ground plane and what type of hardscape you're using. particularly E Street itself along that area? And also, if you could just, as a cross-section, talk to me a little bit about the grade change, if any, in that area, all along from the south lawn to the ellipse.
Well, materially, we would imagine that E Street would use the material of a typical street in New York, in DC today, but because of the low use, we would like to suggest that it would be a bituminous course with asphalt laid and gravel rolled into it, so we evoke more of the feeling of the cartway as it existed in the early 20th century when that road, when E Street was originally created. And I think earlier I said 19th century, but it was the beginning of the 20th century when that was created. I have to say, with all due respect, that materiality was surprisingly the most sensitive issue in working on Pennsylvania Avenue, and one needs to be highly flexible on the subject to survive in D.C. Like the only thing First Lady Laura Bush didn't like about our scheme was the paving, which was kind of the whole idea. So other than that.
And last question to Mr. Friedman.
I just have a comment. I wanted to make sure that, in the interest of, I'm just a consultant to the group here, but I was involved in the selection as chairman for the Pennsylvania Avenue, but I also wanted everybody to know that I've worked with Michael personally and in our other projects, before, which I just want to make sure people are aware of.
And I've never been terminated by Mr. Friedman.
Not yet.
Yeah, and he makes sure you always feels that it's 3 seconds away, let me assure you. Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Chairman, actually, Michael has 2 more minutes, given that he was...
Sure.
So may I ask a question?
You may.
Or maybe a minute left. So, Michael, the major pedestrian path is now southward of the actual East Street corridor, right?
Well, I would say a major path is.
And there are 4 major places where you go from that southern path across to East Street, right?
Not counting the one at 15th and
Right.
17th.
Yes, right. Yeah, okay. And then you cross East Street at those 4 points. And
Right.
Right. Can you walk along East Street itself? And what, can you walk then, if you get to one of those intersections, can you then decide to walk along East Street, or what's that relationship like? Or
The relationship is like that of a normal city street, which is that you cross perpendicular and you don't walk east to west. And based on how quickly the security officers became aware of us inspecting the Welcome to the White House button, which is curiously still on the fence. I don't know if you guys have noticed that. I think as soon as anybody turned onto the cartway, they would probably be told not to do that. But who knows? That would be my guess.
Michael, if I can ask, relative to Sherman Park and First Amendment, you indicate by yellow line there that you envision a fence there. Do I take it that you're envisioning a fence that's somewhat similar to the wrought iron fence that's on the perimeter of the White House grounds now, located over on those areas as well?
We would be completely amenable to that idea. I honestly have to say that in terms of the level of investigation, we haven't really solved that yet, but what you said makes complete sense to me. I would not imagine the need, I would not desire that fence suddenly takes on a particularly contemporary feeling, for instance. I think that sense of dissolving the sense of security, which is clearly the essence of what we're trying to do here, would be best extended by choosing a fencing style. And I think it would be fine that it would work in that way, assuming it could pass the K-12 standards.
And there's also, is there a contemplation that that fence, and I think it's indicated on here on this particular plan, on both the right hand side and left on the dogleg near, and I can't, but it looks like it's near 15th and 17th, that a similar type of fence would then undulate through or meander through the side panels such that there is an opportunity to secure, without running, for example, a bike rack or something like that, there's an opportunity to secure a larger portion of the park, with, for example, if the president were coming by helicopter or otherwise, and then similarly then reopen up the park at some point.
That's kind of a central idea of what we're trying to accomplish here. I mean, not just because of working on Pennsylvania Avenue, but other projects where security is that kind of issue. There needs to be a fluidity, a fairly rapid fluidity, and if it's not provided, our experience is that, I mean, if we don't get this right, what will happen immediately is the site will just be taken up with temporary fencing again. And the primary idea here is that we lose that sense of ad hocism that's out there of bike racks and things, and, you know, very uncoordinated feeling, which to me is the most disturbing part of it, less so than you may be a little crowded to, you know, standing and looking at the White House. The bigger problem is that it looks vaguely ad hoc, and it reveals itself as being, you know, quickly, hastily put together for security, which of course it needed to be.
Thank you.
We call that Sanford and Son perimeter security.
I like that. Better you say that than me, though, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Mendenhall. Before Mr. Krieger introduces our last presenter, I'll say that the order of presentations was decided by drawing names out of a bowl. So, Mr. Krieger?
So with that, last but not least, Rogers Marvel Architects from New York City and their consultants.
Thank you very much, Alex, committee chair, and as Michael pointed out, our peers. I learned that if you put your business card in first, it ends up staying on the bottom, evidently. So we get to follow a steamed list of landscape architects and designers that are looking at President's Park. It's important, I think, as well, to understand the team that we have with us today. My partner, Jonathan Marvel, Peter Rothschild of Quinnell Rothschild and Partners, Robert Duchabella Venter Stone, and Robert Smilowitz from Weidlinger. I also have Aaron Young, an associate of our office, who was up later than I was last night. So thank you very much for inviting us here. And as I think listening through the afternoon, the reverence for the site is something that we all share. The privilege of thinking about it is something that we share and we appreciate very much. And our background, slightly different, really a lot of public space that has often involved security as we become engaged, and we really thought about the place. I mean, it is one of the distinctions, obviously, is the relationship to the White House. You're not sitting in the middle of the mall, you're not in some other green. You are in this garden and this space adjacent to the executive office. And to do that, we really looked at our own lessons from security situations, most office in New York, but we've also worked at the Pentagon on a master plan here in DC, or across the river. But one of the fundamental things that we understand when you're dealing with barriers, security, and the elements, layers are critical and they're absolute and they're required. And we believe that when you separate those layers,
you fundamentally improve public space and you fundamentally improve security. And that is really the underlying goal of this particular project. So we stretched the perimeter to include the ellipse and create it around, and we'll get to the pinch points and the shoulders and the pieces we've been discussing all day. But fundamentally wanted to say that the separation is an absolutely positive thing, and we believe a necessary thing. The other thing we've learned from our security projects is that security is very expensive. And we believe that it is part of our public realm now. We can talk about reversibility. I think it's probably a long ways away. So we're going to make a major investment that is going to be in place for a serious period of time. And if we make that investment and all we get is security, then we haven't really solved our problem. So we believe our second guiding principle for the project today is to talk about how pieces get integrated not just in terms of structural capacity, or is it landscape, or is it architecture, is it site architecture, is it security, is it a bench, but also integrated in such a way that they survive the lengthy process of a project. Because little pieces that don't belong get stripped away. And for a successful public project in the public realm, it's got to have continuity and the success and clarity of an idea to carry it throughout completion and implementation. So we think, number one, the ellipse is that extraordinary space because it is adjacent to the White House. It is not somewhere else. And it is both the place where you have First Amendment rights presentations, you've got protests, Jonathan was here this morning, he got to watch Marine One come in and land. It's compelling even for those of us that have been here many times. It's also, like the president's backyard, it's a playground, it's the play yard of those that live here and occupy the residences and offices around the ellipse. And we believe that the ellipse should be reconstructed with a really super structural turf system that Peter has been working on with us to try and figure it out, so that this has the robust quality of an urban recreational space like we know at the Great Lawn or the Sheep's Meadow, that sustains the kind of use that you're going to put into this place, but also brings to it the kind of grace and success of a landscape over the course of the seasons in the way it's used. And it means that we're going to incorporate and load a lot of things into the ellipse and its perimeter. We think it's both a public space of the national realm and a ball field. We think that there is a formal promenade around the perimeter of the ellipse that many will take. Some will walk straight up across the grass, but if you're pushing a stroller or if you've got small children, you may take the formal promenade around the ellipse in your experience to go and move towards seeing the White House, whether you're a resident or a foreign visitor or tourist. We also are faced with the incorporation of the sort of the horror of 21st century and 20th century landscape, which is surface parking, that is right here in this precinct. And so we feel that that must be upgraded in terms of the management of the parking itself, the way it's drained, its relationship to landscape. So we're proposing that within the zone adjacent to the surface parking, that it's a native planted vegetative swale that also gives you the casual approach, walking among landscape, coming out of the parking lot. You're in the shade. So you've got choices of way to move, even though they begin to be parallel as they go along. And since Weidlinger's on the team, I can assure you that our wall is adequately robust. We've seen some of these things as the day goes along, which is the other part of going last, and you get to share some ideas with your peers. And we were very much attracted to the idea of being able to subtly increase the grade of the ellipse. It allows us to present the anti-ram wall that creates the formal promenade, the bench seating, the vegetated swale, and then the parking as a sort of order hierarchy moving from the ellipse out. It also gives us, as you've heard, the subtle camouflage from the viewing of cars from the White House out, but also the view turned around looking back towards the Washington Monument, and gives us the dimension and capacity to manage the drainage issues, insulate the steam pipe, take on the kind of fundamental things that keep the ellipse from operating at its peak capacity. We also believe that because this is a streetscape and a public space that abuts the White House, it in the same way it has greater demands for security, because nobody worries about my house, but it has greater demands for public space and public opportunity. And we feel that when you're constrained in a linear pattern, you have limited choice, you're waiting in line behind somebody who doesn't know where they're going. If a family's in front of you, how do you move? That there's simply inadequate capacity to handle the front and face of what this park needs to be adjacent to the White House. And by moving the barrier south and around the perimeter of the ellipse, we have opened up and given broad choice for congregation, for movement, for collection, and assembly of public and people around. Our project has to make the executive safe, but there's also incidents outside the fence, and we think it's important that the people are safe and congregate properly there as well. And to do this, we actually have to separate the barriers. We have to remove them, and we have to take them away so that the foreground of the view of the White House is the ellipse itself. E Street is still designated by a change in paving. We've left the historic bollards connected by chains. Chains may come or go depending upon things with the black fence, historic black fence. And we are proposing the promenade of the ellipse in the same white granite that surrounds the White House as the sidewalk, so that it's very clear and demarcated the specialized pedestrian transit zones as opposed to the simple collective space that's in the middle. But to get this openness and freedom, it doesn't mean that you have to relinquish control. This is a diagram when you're completely publicly accessible. We believe with very minor interventions that we can pull that pedestrian population back so that for, the family member takes a stroll in the garden. You've got something, you pull it back right away. But you can also come back to other sets of traditional delineations. And in fact, for events, for scheduled events, for special things, we now actually have a permanent boundary that gives you really high quality situational awareness of things going on within the ellipse and at those key public spaces around the front. And this management and the understanding begins at the entrance from E Street. We think that, we believe and hope that most people are pretty smart. That's the basis of democracy. So we also use that in public space planning and say, if you tell people how to move with materials, with simple lighting, with really straightforward moves, most of the time, the bulk of the people understand how to move. And if it's clear when somebody's not moving that way, then that fulfills the role of security in the public realm. So that if E Street is open, if the view corridor is there, the understanding that this is a processional process to gain access to the south side of the White House, it would be very clear. And we're using just standard traffic calming and streetscape techniques, textured crosswalks, paving that goes through. The challenge really, when you've looked historically at what happens to the ellipse and what it's become, is that the program has changed. We're the architects in the competition, so we're kind of coming at it slightly thing. And for us, it's an issue of program. The introduction of security, the management of events, those collection of pieces that have come in are things that the park was never planned to do. It was never programmed for. And although there's historic reference, excuse me, sorry, to the Downing plan as we've seen today, we really focused in on the east and west groves, the kind of shoulder panels, realizing that these are the places where the program has changed most abruptly, and that's where we can affect comprehensive and understandable change in that program. So very quickly, we've got the Sally Port for the entry of vehicles that are controlled and managed. You've got the opportunity for emergency vehicles or motorcade to continue across. Critically, you've got rejection capacity at the Sally Port, whether it's a bad car or a situation that needs to be dealt with. You've got lay-by capacity so that you can manage, somebody friendly who doesn't have his paperwork. The parking, you'll see, has been rerouted around and egresses at the streetscape. And we've put in buildings and planters and walls to allow us to have the minimum amount of visible security that is, in fact, affecting pedestrian and public realm space. We think it's critical that the staging of events, now that we've restructured the lawn, that we actually have room for vehicles and we can manage them on these large shared surface spaces. The vehicles can make it through the Sally Port and get down in there. But at the same time, the space to the pedestrian is a park space that's comprehensible and understandable, that I'm attending an event. I can see this is my pathway, I belong here. And on times when the events go away, it's got the simple quality of the spaces that are there now improved. In the end, we made 2 or 3 other places where we unprivileged the pedestrian, and that was primarily at the Sally Ports, was to give clearance to the security operations that must take place. We believe they're going to be here for a while. We'd rather not have them too, but that is the reality. And so we've used really low-level plantings, not unlike what's out there now, to simply dissuade and show that pedestrians are not invited to attend the screening operations. We believe a structure and a canopy should be considered so that the quality of lighting, the maintenance of the canine things are part of the security, but we've also created a gateway to the street and to the White House that we're not hiding behind, but is simply part of our life today in terms of the public realm. We believe that the bench that we've introduced at the perimeter of the ellipse can also have subtle impact, like include pedestrian lighting that is different than the light pole lighting that's out in the street parking, but is about the pedestrian experience. Sorry, I'm going to jump past there. And it's really critical to us then that this is not just the President's Park, but in fact is the People's Park. And we think that the approach to be able to walk up through the ellipse, gain access, and to have this view and this prospect while providing security is really the heart of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, very much. Questions from task force members? Mr. May.
Can you explain on the barrier that would go all the way around the ellipse? Is that the same treatment, kind of all the way around? Does it vary depending on the circumstance? And then what's you seem to have some sort of overlapping pieces of wall, and explain that.
For brevity's sake, the piece is a continuous bench, if you will, all the way around, but it's broken at the fundamental entry points. For a very minor entry point, it will have like an 8-foot wide, 9-foot wide stair with a single object in the middle, which we believe would probably be like a bronze sculpted thing that begins to be an iconic character of the outer rim of the ellipse, something along those lines. And then at the big and more consequential entrances, especially at the south, but on the axial entrances, it's a set of stairs flanked by ramps that are parallel, that are small enough in dimension, given the curvature and the width, to meet all anti-ram standards, so that we're accessible at all those points. We felt it's really critical that a large population be able to both access and egress the ellipse very quickly at one time. So the porosity has to be very clear where it is, and it's got to be adequate so that significant numbers of people can move both in and out through that wall.
Mm-hmm. And how much does the grade change of the ellipse itself?
The bench that we're proposing varies between 18 and 20 inches, and so to make up the anti-ram height, the structural fill kind of goes within that as well. We've used a slightly higher overall dimension of 40 inches for the anti-ram wall. We believe with the plantings outside, it's visually appropriate and a little bit better from a defensive point of view. So we're raising the height of the, ellipse itself somewhere between 24 and 36 inches. It's got a slope to the center, slightly crowned, if you will. It's draining to the perimeter, so that with subsystem drainage, we're continuing to also feed the swales that are managed at the perimeter.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions, Mr. Shepherd?
Rob, in this perspective and in the site plan both north of the ellipse is a significant amount of hardscape. Could you speak to that specifically about the amount of hardscape that's on the plan and in the perspective?
Is this a good zone? Yes.
Yeah,
well,
on the sides particularly.
We are looking at this, and we believe that the historic sidewalk of that bollard and gate, that bollard and fence, is maintained at the north side. This is really the full amount of the takeover. We've eliminated the roadbed, so the entire zone where the ellipse roadbed crossed and E Street crossed has been consumed, and that is the hardscape that's here. We've left the large trees that are just in the beginning of the view shed. We think those are actually quite critical to rise through that terrace so that there's shaded parts of that zone. But we feel that that expansive hardscape actually is not inadequate to the demands of what happens in that space, or what can happen in the space given access.
Thank you.
Mr. Goning?
I think I know how the bike circulates, so I won't ask you that question. But what is the extent of how wide is that area? Let's say from the existing bollard line on the sidewalk to the end of the paving material at the pinch point.
We've consumed both of those streets, so I think we're like 45 or 50 feet. We have now the full confessions come out. We've pulled the actual ellipse circle in slightly because we were concerned about its construction relative to the historic route structure of the plants around, and so we actually did increase the dimension of those two road beds combined.
Mr. Lukey?
Yeah, well, so while we're on that, just to clarify, you're pulling the ellipse consistently slightly inboard to accommodate
the route and the dimension of the wall where the sidewalk needs to be of adequate dimension for groups strolling in opposite directions.
And then I guess my question is, I think that the areas I find, you've got basically granite paving at at this crossing, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then the idea is that the side areas go down, talking about now I guess a hierarchy of material.
Yes, the side areas were actually, I should have checked with Michael first. We're borrowing the rustic paving material from Pennsylvania Avenue,
we know all about
or
that.
something similar.
Yeah.
That is, tells you a different story. This is a wildly underused in terms of vehicular space, but we do need to maintain loading vehicle weights. We've got large pedestrian activity in there.
And so if you look at one of these, I guess that lower left image, the islands that are created, I guess those are simply planted areas, is that correct?
Those are planted areas, and they include curbs, some benches, and the benches where we need them to be are of height and create a anti-ram wall.
So, and for example, on the other side, the Butt Mill at Fountain, for example, just lives within one of those.
Yes, exactly. We've hard to find the right words. We've tried a few, but we've broken those panels up. The Downing plan actually subdivided them into 4 independent pieces, and we've tried to maintain that general 4-piece program. That's where we believe buildings can and should occur. We think maybe a building even on the west side makes sense for supplies and maintenance and things of that nature that really need to be out and available for a park to really function and operate. The visitor center restrooms on this side, and that's our belief was also in that way we began to allow the Sallyport to be incorporated programmatically in these sort of the implementation of our generation's activities on these park shoulders, while the ellipse as a lawn is the centerpiece.
So what's interesting is there's much to recommend, I think, that kind of approach. My question, or my comment, maybe you can speak to it, is in this hierarchy of elements, that asphaltic pavement with the exposed aggregate becomes somewhat, actually, rather than becoming a figure, it actually becomes a field, and then these pieces are floating loosely in it, and it's a slight inversion, I think, of some of the other approaches. And
I think
there's a lot of paving, and I wonder where that line is.
And I think we really saw that as a positive. It's this is a shared space, so if bikes are in here, they're meandering very slowly or walking. People are moving through here, strollers, groups. One of the things that I think we were most struck by is that the people really were not in groups, had very little opportunity to linger on the south side here at the south porch. They get moved on, or even other people push them on because it's my turn, get through. And we felt like to give some softness to the experience, you want the focus at the middle we have here, but you really need to be able to move in the side for shade, ice cream, sit down for a minute, decide what you're doing next. And that is also, it's not just the iconic moments, but it's actually the supportive moments of program that will make this really successful.
Thank you.
Mr. Cody?
Could you show the plan that has the close-up of the vehicle inspection, the Sallyport at 15th Street? I'm wondering if what I'm seeing there is, that's a good one.
That's it.
That the rustic paving, which is where pedestrians are supposed to be entering via 15th Street, is also
is right here. This is concrete paving.
Right.
So
the pink. But you also show that as the
That's correct.
rejection area for the
Yes,
vehicles and the exit for the parking.
That's
correct?
The parking enters. We're trying to combine operations a little bit and get the solo guy actually part of the operations. So parking, controlled parking, this is really just, both of these have an ID and manifest check prior to moving into the actual Sallyport. This one controls the assigned parking and the western Sallyport. This one has the manifest check with queuing space off of here. Move through, we've got a double row. We've looked at lots of devices and know a lot about them.
I'm
so
getting
I'm not sure
the vehicular,
So
I'm not getting the pedestrian here. Where's
this
the pedestrian
is purely
coming?
vehicular,
Uh-huh.
and this is pedestrian.
With
The only-
vehicles.
The only time a vehicle is in this lane is either somebody's been rejected, which is really important but infrequent. A parker is leaving, which again, we have the benefit of highly knowledgeable participants in terms of the drivers in this space, which is one of the fundamental
But
keys.
you haven't met our tourists, right?
I've met a few, and I've been one once or twice, and I think that you do have that. But I also think that the shared street space, which is this connection here, is a simple and small dimension that's quite controllable.
Friedman?
Describe for me the aesthetic that you feel. It feels to me like East Street is basically like it is today. Describe to me the entrances from 15th and 17th Street, what it feels like aesthetically to come into that space.
We think that the street, it's quite critical, even if we've taken it over for other purposes, that the fundamental view corridor of the street is maintained, that in fact that is the historic quality of that as a street. And so the corridor is maintained. You're queued. To your right is concrete paving, a booth, and vehicles queuing, which people may approach, but every signal tells you not to go there. The crosswalk moves you through the textural change, whether it's directly related to Pennsylvania Avenue or not, is something that is telling you by its materiality that you know that this is the space in which you belong. We think that the street is raised to eliminate the curb space by the position of the crosswalk. It's classic, instead of raising just a crosswalk, actually that bed is raised all the way across, and that it is instructive and enlightening between the landscape components, the paving components, that is the pedestrian ingress to that.
Other questions? Mr. Friedman?
Can you describe in that section at the bottom again the topographical changes that you're proposing with that wall again? For the ellipse, both on either side of the wall. Yeah.
Right. The parking level is essentially unchanged.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to regrade it. We're going to eliminate the curb so that we can manage all of the drainage back into this side, into the vegetated swale. We have a variable change because we're the exposure of our wall here plus the dimension of the raised piece, and that overall is about 3.5 feet, and it depends. It doesn't flex a lot, but depending on subtlety of grading. So this is really new construction above this height. Mm-hmm. We're trying to work with a foundation that does not go deep, but is partially backed and partially long, so that we stay out of any of the constructed root zones of any of the existing trees. And so the swale will really manage the elevation between how we drain the parking and the resolution at the base of the wall.
So on the parking side, the height of the wall would be approximately what? I know it's variable. And on the ellipse side, it would be generally at bench height, 18
That's
or 20
correct.
inches.
About 18, 20 inches on the bench height and approximately 40 inches on the outboard side.
And so the level of the ellipse across its entirety is raised by several feet. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, and it tapers out at the top where it
Right.
goes flush.
Right, yes,
But
yes.
it is up like 24 inches.
As it moves
28
southward
inches at the
especially.
south. That's
Right.
correct. Which does other things, as
Yes,
been,
as
has
we
been
saw
previously
earlier.
mentioned.
Other questions? Hearing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've been blessed to have 5 extraordinary design teams and concepts presented to us today. As part of our proceedings, we have reserved a public comment period. We have 3 people who have previously signed up. Each public commenter will have 3 minutes. And the 3 people we have signed up in this order are Lindsley Williams, and he will be followed by Megan Carnegie, and then Dr. Hershey. Mr. Williams.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lindsley Williams. I'm speaking to you today as a private person, and I just handed the members of the commission and the review panel a letter that I put together on today's topic, one of which has a bunch of my notes, which is somewhere in there, and I'll do the best I can to recover from that. The first thing I wanted to say is thank you for having this meeting. The second thing I wanted to say is that I think the committee is going to have one heck of a job trying to figure out what's a winner. I think we have 5 winners, and I think we've had a wow afternoon on a wow site, and I'm just enormously impressed and hope for the best. What my letter focuses on is something having to do with the nature and history of E Street, which I want to remind you and the Commission extends a long way from essentially Columbus Circle at Union Station all the way across the city in one linear movement, and then, thank you, and then it extends through the grounds of the White House all the way to Virginia Avenue and perhaps a little bit beyond. And it is a rare street in D.C., particularly as you go further north. F, no, it doesn't go through. G, it doesn't. H, it doesn't. I, it jogs. K, it gets intercepted several places. So that there is no street that flows east-west as well as E Street from that point on north. You can, of course, go down to Constitution, and it serves that purpose too. But something happened when the street was closed that we all miss, and I want the Commission and the selecting group to take a look at that. And essentially, in my last paragraph of what's written, you say that you'll see that I'm asking that you take no steps that would preclude the reestablishment of some kind of viable east-west connection across that or under it, and to look particularly at the features that are already in place, whether they're steam tunnels, as were depicted on one of the panels, or old sewage drains, whatever it is, or whatever is planned. The last panel we had here showed a series of pretty heavy walls and things going in, and things like that aren't easily thought about later to do something that you need to do after the resources permit that to happen, namely the establishment of or the restoration of viable east-west traffic, probably separated from the visitor function for all the reasons of orderly movement as well as for security. Now, thanks to my papers returning, I can say not only we have WOW, I also wanted to encourage us to think about the need to make sure that this becomes an all-federal domain. Much as the architect of the Capitol has control of those grounds, I think the federal government here needs to have exclusive control so that if things need to be adjusted, they can be adjusted in a straightforward way. Now, I did like one thing that came up earlier in today's discussion, you liked it too, sir, which was the lighted bollards. But I'm hoping that we'll have 51 and we'll just leave one light bulb out for a moment. I would also like to encourage you to be thinking about the need to control what goes on inside this precinct. And my fear, ladies and gentlemen, my fear is that what lines 15th Street now, that's the V word, vendors, will somehow find their way into this space and start to besmirch something that is of critical import and dignity for all of us. And I would encourage us to figure out ways to think about all these things from that which lies underneath to that which might creep onto the surface and make this into the kind of place we all want it to be. Thank you very much. I finished on time.
Thank you very much. And do we have with us Megan Carnegie? She isn't here. And then going on to Dr. Hershey. Welcome, Dr. Hershey.
I'm Robert Hershey. I'm the past president of the District of Columbia Society of Professional Engineers. And I did my doctoral dissertation in engineering on dynamic loading of things like blast. And I have thoroughly analyzed the situation around the White House and concluded that there is no reason to have East Street closed. The White House is basically a fortress, that it was redone in the 1950s with 660 tons of steel reinforced concrete. Nothing could happen to it even if there was a car bomb on East Street. In fact, Pennsylvania Avenue could be reopened also. The distances are just too great to have a blast effect. We're talking 350 feet on the Pennsylvania Avenue side and over 500 feet on the East Street side. And what has occurred is, as has been pointed out by Mr. Williams, a traffic problem. That we had 26,000 cars per day going this route across town on Pennsylvania Avenue or East Street, and now they can't go there anymore. The street should have been kept open way back when, but now that security is a little bit better, the situation's improved, it definitely should be open now. For this reason, what we're talking about here is a waste of the taxpayers' money, of having all these things done and keeping East Street closed. What should be done is take the whole thing back, and then when East Street is reopened, take another look at the situation. What we have here is the situation where there's a grasp on the money because, oh, it's security. So for security, you have to always spend the money. No, this is not a security situation. It never was, and East Street should be reopened right away. And I have had several testimonies here before NCPC and op-eds in the Washington Post saying the same thing, and I'm happy to defend the engineering view of it, that the East Street should be open now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hershey. That ends the public comment period, and we're drawing to a close on today's proceedings. As chair, I'd like to thank the task force members and our staff who have put in countless hours to get us to this point today, and acknowledge the public who has followed this process very closely. Today we have something approaching 100 written comments that have been submitted to us through various media. And especially I want to thank and acknowledge the extraordinary work that has been done by the 5 design firms. I think we would all agree that we have had an all-star cast, an all-star lineup of design firms who have presented to us today. From this point forward, the task force will reconvene tomorrow. We're in executive session. We will begin, after digesting and sleeping on all of this tonight, we will begin deliberating tomorrow. So with that, Mr. Dowd, as staff leader of this project, Mr. Krieger, do you have any final words? Today's been, we're all speechless. Today's been a very exciting day, just speaking personally. I think it's been very exciting, very historic, and it makes me wish I were here every day. Mr. Acosta grimaces at that thought. It could be worse. Mr. Friedman could be here every day. My good friend, Mr. Friedman. Thank you to everyone who has participated today, and we are adjourned.